A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes, as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. This week, that would be through the end of Mistborn, the Hero of Ages, the end of Era 1, and our Era 1 coverage for the most part. I mean, we've got two more little episodes, a guest episode and a thing, but this is the last chapter episode. So finish the book. Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
I'm drunk on book right now.
Book drunk?
Book drunk, but not alcohol drunk because it's July yet. It's not July when you hear this, but we've still got a couple days of July for us here in the past.
And we decided to stick to it just to round out the episodes. And we figured I thought it would be a better idea because then we could come at that last episode as like an intoxicating mess to talk about the Hero of Ages, because it's just going to be you and I, which will be a different spin on that one. But we've got so many predictions to pay off and so many other things to talk about with the whole series that I kind of wanted this one to just be us. So.
And I think it makes sense to have, since we have such a backlog of predictions, I think it'll make sense to do that in a wrap-up episode where we're covering the entire book. Because then, then we can start talking about them more and like, the implications of them.
Yeah, exactly. And it wraps up into the entire series as well. So it's kind of like there's a couple of different things. So,
have you made a count yet?
No, I haven't gone through and formally deducted or done that. I figure I'll probably do that at some point this week. So
okay, I guess I can help because I know also everything in this series.
So today
is our dangle.
Oh yeah, I can. Today is our 11th and final episode discussing The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about chapters 76 through the end. But before we do that, generally we talk about what we're drinking. We're recording this on an afternoon. I don't think either of us came armed with mocktails. I guess it is a morning. Yeah, you're right. It is morning still.
It's 9 a.m. for me.
That's fair. It's 10-ish for me. So, yeah.
So I've got water. Big old vase glass of water again.
Me too. And I've got the remnants of my coffee. It's about a third a cup of coffee. It's a very good single origin blend from Counterculture that I ordered that I'm really enjoying. Citrus and savory. I highly recommend people trying other coffees. Like, if you haven't, go buy a weird bag from a local place and just give it a go. Give it a try. Give something different a try than your typical, because I think you can find some really interesting things out there without trying too hard.
Yeah. I think you and I have very different tastes in coffee.
We do. You have the wrong taste in coffee.
I do not like acidity in my coffee at all.
It's because you've had bad acidic coffee.
No, I've had good acidic coffee. I've had coffee that you've made for me, that you've raved about.
Even me, okay, I am in the craft of making coffee. I am still mediocre at best because I didn't have a lot of temperature control. I don't do all of the right exposure shit. I don't have the technical equipment to rip really good and interesting shots of 9-bar espresso. So I would say what I would recommend to a lot of people of whom maybe want more, or I think that this is even a fun date idea. Go to a coffee roaster tasting. They have them everywhere. Basically, all you do is you end up tasting a bunch of different coffees, and they run you through their different flavor profiles. And it is a lesson that is unparalleled in terms of figuring out what exactly you like in coffee. And you might not, you don't like the citrusy notes that I like in coffee. That's fine. There are lots of other spectrum. I think a lot of people get lost in this idea of just dark roast versus light roast and medium roast or whatever, and that's not how coffee really works at all. But it is it's very much like this is a YA book, this is an adult book. It's a stupid fucking marketing term that's used to overwhelmingly put thing into group so that human can make choice about thing, even though that's a bad way of making a choice.
Right. Like politics.
Yes. So I guess that's my little drink thing. What I would say is, like, you can find these places everywhere. You could go to Minneapolis and St. Paul. There are roasters there that do tastings. I highly recommend it.
I think we've got a new one in St. Cloud, actually, that I haven't been to yet.
Oh, a roaster? Like a coffee roaster?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Kinder. Something
no
like
idea.
That.
But that's cool. They probably do tastings. So I'd be shocked if they didn't, to be honest. But that tends to be the best way. I went to a counterculture tasting, and oh my God, I went to like 5 or 6 tastings when I worked for a coffee company, and love counterculture stuff. They're from North Carolina. It's what I use my subscription. They make great stuff. But I switch it up. And so I try to add in other flavors and try other varietals of coffee as much as possible. And the single origin is really great. It is simultaneously light and citrusy as well as savory. So it's got like some sour, but then like almost some like meaty, earthy tones, which is really interesting. Nice. It's a weird descriptor, but you know the way that like blood tastes in a steak?
Yeah.
Kind of similar. Doesn't actually taste like that. That irony, not the rest of it, if that makes sense. It's got some thickness to it. I mean, obviously it's just fucking water, but it's got like some, I don't know.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
That quality. Yeah.
That happens with beer too.
Mm-hmm. So I really dig it. God, it's so good. It's such an interesting blend. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Sweet.
Cool. I guess that's enough drink talk because we're having water.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to get to talk about this a lot over the course of the week and next week's episode, but I guess we're at the end of a series. We've wrapped up our second series, I should say, on the show. What do you think about this week's reading? What do you think about the series? Render judgment unto Caesar as you would.
Oh, man. I want to reserve like the series as a whole until this question for next week.
Well, right. Quick thoughts.
But this section, man, I love rules. You know I love rules. Everybody listening to this knows I love rules. And I got so much like all these puzzle pieces clicking together finally. Rules. Awesome. Loved it. I felt like there was some interesting choices when it came to like resolutions for some characters, but at the same time, I loved the epilogue and the way that Spook kind of becomes the central character to the world. Yeah, I'm having trouble finding a specific word to attribute to this, but I feel overall content and happy with the ending of this book.
Cool. I'm very excited. I know that I had came down. We'd had a conversation. We're recording this on a Friday. We had a conversation on Monday when you had finished reading the book before we recorded and talked about The Bear for PJ Symposium. And I came down really hard on this book, and we'll definitely talk more about that in next week's episode. But I do want to say that in actually compiling these notes, I have softened a little bit more. We'll talk more about my sort of grand opinion of this series, I think, in the Hero of Ages wrap up. But I did definitely soften when I was doing the notes here, because I think I don't know what it was about that day, or maybe having finished it and then talking to you about it, but I came off very aggressive, overly negative, as I'd had some other compounding feelings about a number of different things relating to the series or otherwise. So I just wanted to say, not that anyone here has heard my thoughts or opinions, but I think even in the lead up to it, I was feeling this build of like anxiety and resentment and a little bit of dread, because this book at times is weaker and at times is much stronger than the previous entries for very different reasons. And I don't think when I initially addressed that I was giving it quite enough due, but I'm excited to talk about what that means more next week. Yeah, if that makes sense.
And you seemed pretty clear in that conversation that you specifically had these feelings about like your third read through of the book.
Yes, which I do have. Yeah, we'll talk more about that, but specifically, I think, okay, the hot drop to get you to check out next week's episode. I think this series, for the most part, is not one that rewards rereads as much as I would like versus other series. I feel like there's so much that is factually established that you can get a lot out of a second read through. But because of the way that it's composed and written, personally, I didn't get that much out of this third read through. I did catch a lot of different details and some fun things that I hadn't noticed before. But was it all a fun ride? I don't know. We'll talk about more next week.
Magic is gone a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and it could just be the proximity of those reads too. It hasn't had enough time to grow fond. I mean, the first time that I had read this series was last summer, and so it's not as though I've lived a long way away from the story and then came back and revisited it a couple of times. It's more like a fresh retread, which inadvertently is another reason that I am kind of glad that we are going to be separating Stormlight a little bit, so that it will kind of be like a fresh retread, a year plus down the line from when I started and read the series. So
gotcha.
I think overall, yeah, I'm excited. But that said, we'll talk more about that next week. My thoughts about this week reading, this is as good of an ending as you could ever want from all of the setup that this book does, that the story does, and it is a fantastic conclusion, I think, to what the story was trying to get us to think about and feel, and the themes therein. So,
yeah, I'm just realizing now that those rules that I was talking about before, a lot of them really came together last section.
Yeah.
Yep. There were still some, though.
Well, there were still some rules or clarifications on things, mostly through the logbook, that communicate a lot of those ideas and solidify them in ways that we had predicted, or that you had predicted or had conjecture about. So I think that's one of the interesting things, is that at a certain point, when you start to understand the rule system behind Mistborn, you start to be able to make your own assumptions about how things work as you go down kind of the line of episodes and thinking and whatnot.
Yeah.
Episodes. I meant chapters. But yeah. Cool. With that, let's get into the episode on the whole here. We've got our breakdown. We start with chapter 76. And, I know I spent a lot of time last week talking about why I ended up extending the episode to where it was. And it's because this intro, I knew from the very beginning of doing this series, is where I wanted this final episode to open, because I think it is such a fantastically strong moment of writing, and something that's very simple. It's very aloof. There's this immediate sense of detachment, as though she's floating in this dream, remembering past events. It's the only thing that she could possibly imagine encompassing this sort of expansion of thought, in the way that she feels so distant from the ground that she was previously walking on. All of these various memories and moments are flitting through her mind as she transcends truly into godhood. And it is a perfect opening to a chapter and a climax. And I just couldn't help myself. I knew that this is where this was going to begin to end.
Yeah, I get it. I totally get it. I would have done the same thing if I was in your shoes. I love in this opening that she's confused not only about where she is, but when she is. I thought that was, it was a really good way to establish that her mind has completely sort of opened up and changed a little bit, and she's able to remember all these things so clearly and vividly that she might even be there in her head at the moment. I thought this was a good sort of use of your part, on your part, the sort of way you broke down this chapter, on top of just everything that's going on. The fact that this sort of subverts my expectations of who the author is right away at the beginning of me reading this section, on top of the cool perspective. So very well chosen.
Yeah, I think that's another part of it too. Obviously, right now we know how the book ends. We know where everything goes. We know that Sazed's actually the hero of ages. But this sort of detachment immediately just started as oh, whoa, was I wrong? Because you do have this assumption. I think you get it kind of in the middle of the book. I got it very similarly to where you got it, where it's oh, Sazed is the hero of ages. We don't really know what the fuck that means, or to what extent, that line is drawn. And this is a moment where it's oh shit, was I wrong this whole time? Like, he really hasn't been using like any sort of gendered pronouns intentionally for talking about himself. He is ignored using Vin's name in text as often as possible. He does refer to Vin at one point as she in the last week's reading, talking specifically about her, but just vaguely enough that you think it could be like third person dissociative, like, because she's so removed that it feels like it's all tangible. And I tried my hardest to reinforce that and trying not to also like dissuade you from your thoughts, because I'm not here to gaslight you into believing something different. I'm instead here just to make sure that you're maybe continuing to question things or pointing to details that are intended to make you question things. So yeah, I love cannot overstate the power of this opening.
Mm-hmm.
And just like that dream state that we're talking about, where she doesn't know when, where, why, how she is, she continues to wake up. And it really begins to not only paint this lens of understanding for what Vin faces waking up into godhood, but what Rashik faced when he picked up the power to begin with. To immediately be confronted with this dark cloud and just this incredible power to wipe away the ash from the sky, to plug the ash mounts, to immolate the earth almost immediately on accident because of these decisions, just shows how truly dangerous a reactionary god could be in those moments, and the delicate balance of all of these powers. I love the little line, like a maid wiping soot from a dirty window, as though it's just so easy that it's as simple as a hand wave.
Yeah, we can assume that this is what Rashik felt like, based on the way the logbooks have described the actions. I don't think they're quite on level grounds, though, with their opportunities. Rashik was given this very fleeting several moments to make these changes. And while those couple minutes were paramount and he was able to change so much in that little bit of time, Vin's still kind of left with this lingering effect. And she's truly kind of ascended to this godhood to the point where, like, as far as we can tell at this point, kind of permanently inhabiting the position that preservation previously held. And I guess that brings the question, is she in this moment technically preservation? I don't know if that distinction is ever really made, but probably not, I guess. Maybe that's the sort of source of the splitting of the power that we talk about towards the end, at the end of this book. But yeah, that's kind of where my thought process goes.
I guess there are words. Oh God, this is where this gets really difficult. This is also why the Cosmere is so fucking cool now that you've experienced it, right? So there are explanations. That's kind of what this book teases at the end, right? Is that there is something much larger. There are explanations that exist for a lot of these things. I think there are a couple of safe assumptions that I can give you that will explain things without spoiling anything else. Vin is very much holding the power of preservation. I don't know that she held it long enough to be labeled preservation, if that makes sense. She wasn't inhabiting the power for so long that it had changed. Like, she was able to still push against some of the prerogatives of preservation because she was also constructed of ruin, right? So, like, that's the end of this, right? I think also that we're a little bit, that your assumption on Rashik is close but a little bit off. He is holding the power for fleeting moments, but as we see here, like, everything's a fleeting moment to a god. And we see so much time pass so quickly for Vin. Like, there's a lot of shit that's going on from our people's perspective on the ground. But for Vin, I think that's why it's so important that it, like, intercuts so quickly to her all the time, is to be like, she just makes snap decisions constantly. She doesn't have time to, like, sit around and watch. She's kind of stuck in the same fleeting clock. Not to say that the power is draining from her. She's not losing the power in the same way that the well's power is recoalescing. It's more close to compare if someone was able to hold all of the atium in them at once, right? It's more close to compare the well of ascension, I should say, to the pile of atium, or all of the atium that could have ever existed, because those are sort of the opposites intentionally, wherein the mists are more the dispersion of preservation's power versus Rune having coalesced it all into himself, right? Does that make... I know I'm kind of ranting a little bit here to try to connect all of these dots now that we're at the end. I think it's tough to say that Rashik was preservation, right? It's tough to say that Vin was preservation. I think they were holding the powers of preservation. I think Sazed is set up to long-term be preservation because he's holding complete versions of both powers.
Well,
he's preservation and Rune,
in that respect. Different. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he's we'll get there, but yeah,
the hero of ages.
Right. But do you understand what I mean? Like that's kind of the distinction is like, I don't think, and we never approach this point. So it's very hard to kind of do anything but assume. I don't think you would call Vin preservation. You would say that she was holding that power.
Okay.
And she was intended to be a holder from the beginning, right? So she was imbued with even more preservation than usual so that she could manage.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which we'll get to when we get to that logbook. So we don't need to talk about it now. Obviously, we're going to be talking a lot about this power as we go through the week's readings, but there's a lot here, man. And that's just the beginning kind of the problems that stem from her awakening as she starts to feel out this balance and see how she's being manipulated in those early moments to destroy through a lack of information. I mean, that's the biggest thing. We talked about Rashik's experience. It's the same thing here for Vin. And as such, Rune is kind of having a heyday with her kind of going through and creating an ocean wave that's going to wipe out a tidal city and stops her from intervening to save. And we really kind of see the push and pull of these forces. And Vin is acting, believing that she's going to be preserving and helping, but actually causing Rune. And Rune could have stopped all this shit, but he's like, no. You're new to this.
Yeah, it is kind of funny to see Rune stop her at a certain point. I don't want to get too much into semantics regarding like manipulation, because I don't think he manipulated her into ruining things. I think he just kind of knew that it was a trap and let her fall into it, you know, letting her spin the world a little bit too fast and seeing those like dire reactions to her good intentioned motions. So it's only when she starts to pinpoint those reactions and like say, hey, I did this, it caused this, let me stop that those stops happen. Mm-hmm. He pushes back. And I love this way of explaining how this world operates and how they're in this deadlock constantly between ruin and preservation. But he did let her have that little minute, that little second of whoop,
mm-hmm. Yeah, of the chaotic destruction, the booba, as it were. No, I really like that as a little rejoinder. And yeah, to your point, I didn't mean manipulation in the sense that he's like actually actively puppeting her or anything, but he is just kind of standing idly by and being like, you know, just letting her basically fall to her own ignorance is more the sort of setup of Rune in this moment. Also, apologies, folks. I know that I say both Rune and Ruin, and I pronounce it 3 different ways. I can't control myself. It's how it fits into a sentence. There is a beat in Stephen King's The Dark Tower in which a group of people are referred to as runt, and I think that runt the way that I say ruin anyway. That's a permanent change that I don't know if I'll ever get over. That is the most that you know about The Dark Tower as well.
There's a tower.
There's a tower. Apparently people are ruined.
Probably dark. Cool. In color,
yeah,
maybe.
Probably. We also get some big drops about the creation of humanity here, that it was something that he'd seen before, that Ruin and Preservation had seen before, and it almost seems like he enjoyed this act of creation with Preservation too in this moment. Also, Ruin is very much just kind of running his mouth at this point. Vin isn't really saying anything. He's very much just like there talking and kind of having a good time. He did feel a bit odd about the gifts that Preservation had bestowed upon humanity, as it would obviously create an imbalance in the long run, but there's something missing here that he's still trying to track down. We've known this has been his intent the whole time, and that's to actually find his body so that he can truly overcome this power imbalance between the group of them.
Yeah, it is a big drop, as you say, about the like that we've seen something like this before, but I really didn't catch it, and I think there was just a lot going on and I was kind of caught up with it, but I didn't really catch that. I'm assuming at this point that was Kelsier, like the first attempt. But
what? Explain.
Oh, creation of humanity. I was thinking creation of Vin.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Creation of humanity. Okay. That is a little bit wider scoped than I was even prepared for. So anyway, I don't know what to make of that. If that's another species of some sort, if there was another planet that they had inhabited and subsequently destroyed, or a series of them, maybe. I don't know. But this play by preservation to create an imbalance but to kind of counteract it by hiding the atium and delay at least the snowball effect of the imbalance. Kind of nice, kind of sneaky.
Very sneaky. And I think Rune's okay with it too. That's the other thing, because he's like, well, if you're putting some power into them there, that's just going to make me more powerful in the end when I destroy them. Like, I'm going to be able to overpower you and actually be able to execute on our contract. So kudos. He kind of has that sort of reaction in this moment where it's like, yeah, he knew he wasn't blindsided by the fact that the power of preservation was in humanity.
His state and his sort of disposition during this section of this book seems so starkly different than it was just before Vin ascended.
What do you mean?
Would you agree with that? He was so driven and so angry about like finding this atium stash, and I guess at this point he knows where it is on the ground, so he's a little bit more calm, I guess, maybe. But his interactions with Vin seem less emotionally charged than they were before.
That's fair. I think he's also not trying to emotionally manipulate her to make decisions anymore. So like he is on top of that, like behaving differently because he's like, oh, you're on my level now. Well, now you see things the way that I see things, so I don't need to like push you. This is kind of that idea that you were mentioning. You're like, manipulated feels a little bit too strong. Before he was manipulating, before he was puppet mastering. Now he's like, cool. All right, you're here. I'm gonna go on a couple of villain monologues and just real quickly make sure that you're caught up to speed on everything that's going on in the world.
Stop you from blocking a fucking tsunami, which is going to destroy some group of people that we don't know about.
Yeah, some coastal town somewhere is having a bad time.
Yeah. Atlantis, I think, is what it's called.
Well, now. Yeah. There's a pretty good final note here, too, that I want to bring up regarding this section, and it kind of gets into this idea, even as we're talking about like the tidal wave and everything else. I really enjoy the idea of Rune and preservation, and, you know, Rune and Vin in this case, kind of controlling these armies that they can't really touch or help in any serious way. And it feels like a 4X game, like Civilization, running with like just computers playing, but you're like watching and you're like, oh shit, if I would have picked that, or if I would have done this, it would have all came out differently. Why didn't I put Gandhi in the game? Gandhi would have gone for like a peaceful route, blah blah blah. It just has this like very detached scope where you wish you could go back a couple of turns ago and like reload your save and like go back in and like make these changes, but you can't, because Vin never had the ability to set up the chessboard to begin with. She has to play the hand that she's dealt. Yeah, but she doesn't have very much, but she does have Elend.
Now I want to play Civ. Actually, what I want to play is Crusader Kings.
Oh yeah, fair. Crusader Kings kind of does play that way now. You say that, because you can kind of influence things, but you can't be like, marry them.
I mean, yeah,
you get pretty close.
You can get kind of close to it.
Yeah, you can almost force the hand, but you can't quite. You can force the initial hand pretty firmly because it's your king, and then after that, it's like, why'd my fucking offspring do that? God, I love 4X games.
So Kaylin's working all weekend. I think I might have a date with my graphics card.
Excellent. That was a great joke. Cool. That's fun. It'll be a fun time. I have to get to 77. Cool. All right, our logbook. We move on to chapter 77 here. We've got our logbook. Looking back, we should have been able to see the connection between the mists, allomancy, and the power at the Well of Ascension. Not only could Allomancer's visions pierce the mists, but there was the fact that the mists swirled slightly around the body of a person using any kind of allomancy. More telling, perhaps, was the fact that when a hemologist used his abilities, it drove the mist away. The closer one came to Ruin, the more under his influence, and the longer one bore his spikes, the more the mists were repelled.
Okay. I don't think this fully, I guess it kind of does. I just need to think about it better. But how the mists change their reaction to Vin. She's initially embraced by them, but then after the well, they start turning on her, being repelled by her. And I wasn't sure if that was simply because Ruin had more influence on Vin, despite him having influence from the beginning. But the explanation of it, the amount of time the spike's embedded and the fact that she's more consistently wearing it, starts to make more sense.
Another thing to add into those layers is she wasn't burning tin while she was wearing the earring before. Like when she was growing up, she was almost never burning tin intentionally, right? So she wasn't really using hemalurgy ever, despite being infused with a hemalurgical spike. So it wasn't until she was given her Mistborn capabilities, well, not given, but she explored her Mistborn capabilities with Kelsier, that she started to burn tin. And so it's not until then that that the hemalurgic spike wouldn't do more than minor repelling. And she wasn't wearing the spike for the entirety of Mistborn. It was in and out of her ear variously over the course of time. Yeah. But it was the only metal thing that she intentionally kept, obviously.
And she regularly had it just in that little meager pile of her possessions that she would sort of look at. Whatever it was her earring and I can't even remember.
Earring, a couple of things from Marine, some dirt and sand from other places, or rocks, I think, from other places.
Rocks sounds right.
From where she'd been. So, yeah, I personally feel like it's very well explained as to why. And the other thing being, when she's fully exposed to Preservation's power at the well, she not only unleashes ruins, all of Ruin's bits have more influence over the world and are clearly pushing against things more firmly after the Well of Ascension. But on top of that, she was soaked in Preservation's power, and so is naturally, when spiked, it's I need to get further away from you because there's a conflict here internally. Because the power wants to be with more than any other individual on the planet, and because of that spike, it's verse. Yeah.
Reverse.
Yeah. So we move to Elend standing among the rubble, and he's he is kind of distraught at the destruction of such a powerful and notable landmark of his life in the form of Creedic Shaw crumbled to the ground. He really brings into question how this devastation could have occurred, and it seems only possible that it could have been a force outside of normal comprehension, tying it to the power at the Well of Ascension.
Oh, that rhymes. He's right. Kind of. He's right for the not in the way that he thought. It is a force that that's outside of normal comprehension, but that force is his wife.
Right. I really love this, and I know that's something that Brandon's talked about quite a bit, that he's upset with in post of this book, is that it doesn't return to Luthadel enough, because Luthadel is kind of a character in the other two books. And so he's said that in an adaptation, he would try to center more of the story around Luthadel as he could afford to kind of make it, a bigger deal in the long run for an adaptation.
Yeah, I think we'll probably get to it soon, but I think that could have easily been done if we had Lord Penrod as a perspective. And I think his arc would have been a lot more satisfying as well, as opposed to just seeing it in brief glimpses from Ellen's perspective.
Yeah.
Do we get
and from Sazed? or marsh. I think in this book, it's predominantly marsh, a little bit of Tensoon and kind of the impacts of what's going on with Penrod. But yeah, there's not a whole lot of Penrod in this book. We also get some mentions, of course, and some, from scouts and, messengers and whatnot running between. But yeah, this is always something that Brandon's highlighted. He's like, art's never done, right? But if you have the opportunity to return to something and like adapt it, which it seems is very likely in the coming future that we will see one of the series adapted into film or TV. Mm-hmm. This is one of the things that he said that he would want to change, is to make more of this book focus around Luthadel.
Yeah, I would have absolutely wanted that.
Yeah. I still think, I have no problem with it as written, and it's good because we still get the coming home nature of like Vin returning and like fighting among Creedic-Shaw. All of her big climaxes happen in Creedic-Shaw, right? Like her first conflict, killing the Lord Ruler, the Well of Ascension, and then exploding Creedic-Shaw. It's a very nice comeuppance arc for, the city of Luthadel in its own right. So I don't think he underplayed it, but it's underrepresented inside of this book.
Mm-hmm.
All the beats are there. It just needed more time, arguably.
You bringing up Lord Ruler and her conflict with him at the end. The mists that now we know definitively are the power of preservation.
Mm-hmm.
And the entire point is to, like, the idea was to keep Ruin in check throughout this whole thing. And the Lord Ruler was the tool in which that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Why were the mists assisting Vin in killing the Lord Ruler?
Well, the Lord Ruler was wearing hemalurgic spikes, so he could never be touched by the mist.
So it was hubris then.
And Vin was given the capability to call upon the mists, was like selected by preservation, right? Like that's a big deal that's made inside of this section by Ruin and by Sazed through the logbook, is that Vin was very much like hand selected at 16, no less, just to further emphasize that little number there. That's when she becomes a Mistborn, is at age 16. So, I mean, she's chosen from birth, don't get me wrong, but she is 16 when she comes of age and everything starts to happen to her.
Right.
So
special.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. We'll talk about all of these components as we kind of get to them as well, but it's tough not to. This is always the issue with the end of a book, is it's always like, it's so hard to not bring up all the other stuff that happened, to like reconnect it and recontextualize the things so the story in the end makes sense. But focusing on the text, there's another detail that I really love here, and that is Elend looking up and seeing the stars blazing above. It really paints, again, how different this world is than ours, where we can just go out and peer up at the sky and millions of stars light years away are glimmering down at us. And you begin to feel why something like could be very attractive, to worship those stars as 1,000 eyes judging and staring down at you and watching your behavior, and just sort of the whole religion and math of the whole thing. I really appreciate this a little bit. It's small, but I think it's a really big deal.
It is. Absolutely. And I think that it's more relatable than you're kind of leading on, because anybody in a big city or even like a medium-sized city can have this feeling, maybe to a lesser extent, but just going out into the wilderness. For me, my cabin growing up was my favorite place in the world, specifically for this reason, because just laying out in the middle of nowhere, staring up at the sky, it was stunning. Oh, there is somebody, like, if you grew up and like lived your whole life in Seattle, you probably do feel like this. But, I think this is just a more extreme version of that awe-inspiring feeling of seeing stars with zero light pollution.
Yeah, agreed. I think a little bit too intense. Like, this is so much more intense than even that is, because the idea that the stars were even there is something that isn't presented. Yeah, because he's like, when he looks up and sees the stars, he's really also fixated by the lava and everything burning to the ground, kind of around him. So it's like, it's a very exciting sight, but at the same time, all of the world is very different.
Fair.
We go from the destruction of the Lord Ruler's palace of Critic Shaw, past the glorious sky, and into Keep Venture, the house that he grew up in. And it is certainly disturbingly empty, and the whole thing feels very off to Elend, with almost everyone in the building being dead or missing entirely. And there's one notable man, of course, of whom killed himself and left a message for Elend, that of Lord Penrod.
Yeah. I didn't quite have the impact as I wish I would have, and I think, like I was mentioning before, seeing more of Penrod would have been really helpful. I think both from the Luthadel standpoint and from just more of kind of Ruin's influence. I think we would have been even better able to understand Quellion and his actions leading a different city if we had Del's perspective. So,
yeah, I think this gets back to the point of like, that's how the focus could really shift in a fun way, would be if we could have, not a fun way necessarily, but we would have more of an impact in this moment. It just, again, this book covers so much fucking ground that it's almost as though it doesn't give enough focus to any individual part, except for a couple of side stories. Like, everything is just moving. We were talking about how in previous weeks, all these dominoes are getting set up and like how it seemed like nothing was happening. But in reality, he has to do that because he has to get us to this point. And yeah, it just leads to it leads to where we are at this point.
It does feel a little like dominoes, but dominoes with like a 4-year-old coming in, like also just kind of wrecking stuff.
That's totally fair. That's a good analogy. I was imagining like a domino that was stretched to its limit so that it could crash into the next one. Like, it's just going to touch it so that it hits. It's not going to cleanly connect to push the next domino. It's kind of the way that I feel like some of this goes. It's like, more on Penrod would have been awesome. More on Luthadel would have been really important. Giving us more of a sense of some of the danger in we were just talking about the danger of too many perspectives, but slowing the story down a little bit. I know that trilogies are beautiful and we love the idea of threes in humanity, but sometimes you need to stretch a book into a fourth book and, to make everything feel right.
Is that what happens with Era 2, kind of? Or was that always intended to be?
Era 2 is kind of a different boat. This isn't really a spoiler. The first book was intended to just be a one-off. And then Brandon was having so much fucking fun with the characters that he wrote a trilogy afterwards. So he like wrote the one book and was like, okay, this is just gonna be like a fun side novel before going into what he really wanted Era 2 to be, which is now Era 3. And then he was having so much fun with the weird Era 2 story that he was like, fuck it, we're doing a whole thing here. Which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, so he accidentally added 4 books onto his plan, basically, or 3 books onto his plan.
Gotcha.
So yeah, it's a single book and then a trilogy.
Cool.
That's how to think about it. Anyway, yeah, I guess I was using that obvious comparison to Lightbringer, right? Where it's like you have so many things set up that like, do you sacrifice character at the altar of I need to make things happen? And the answer there, I think, more often than not, should be no, despite that sometimes being disappointing because you have to wait longer for something to happen. Yeah. I'm looking at you, Game of Thrones season 8. All right. Great example. But it is important to say that like Penrod's death is still kind of felt through Elend. It doesn't have the weight that I feel like it should, kind of like we were saying, but it is still a moment of sadness for Elend because this was his like political victory in a big way, that he was actually establishing the system, that it was beginning to work, and Penrod's death kind of signals the death of that idea for the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I don't know. I think it's a much bigger defeat than it's lent credence or
it
time
is.
to. But
yeah, I think it probably hits Elend a lot harder than it hits us. It's just kind of a side effect of how crazy this story already is.
Right. He's got to go. He's like Sonic. He's got to go. Got to go. Run to the next thing, which Penrod does point him directly north towards the Terrace Dominance. But obviously, at this point, Elend's worked out all of Ruin's little tricks, and so he knows that it's wrong and gets a whisper in his ear that directs him otherwise west towards the pits of Hatson. That whisper, of course, is Vin.
I think specifically because we get this side-by-side perspective between Vin and Elend, but we get this this perspective of Vin controlling the world and affecting the world on this macro level. So it's almost hard to comprehend that she can also control things on this micro level and get so granular, and Ruin's able to manipulate these words so precisely and so specifically. I that incomprehension, I guess, is kind of the point, but it is very cool to see like both sides of their influence.
It is, because it speaks to the ability for like Preservation to interact a lot more directly, and then for Ruin to have to damage something in order to impart an impression, right? So like that difference is really nuanced between the two of them. The other thing that this really makes me think about a lot is that it really does a really good job of delineating the power of the person of whom was holding Preservation before, of whom died and was communicating with Elend by jumping up and down and waving hands around, versus Vin's ability to directly interact and the power that she really pulled in when she pulled in the mists that had been spread out everywhere, because our original holder of Preservation wasn't able to communicate that well or at all like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder how much of that was always the case, or if that was kind of a sacrifice made when giving up some power to imprison Ruin. Like the ease of communication. I don't know.
I think you're right with kind of the latter, is that when he gave up his power, he gave up the ability to interact directly. Like he created the mists at large and created and put a lot of his body into humanity in the form of Preservation in general, which is another reason that he can probably more directly interact with people, is he can talk through his little bit with that little bit of power that's stored in everyone. So I think that there are a number of different things that you can point to say like, hey, this is clearly Preservation functioning as intended, but that still makes the old Preservation that we had previously seen a lot weaker and unable to communicate compared to Vin holding the power.
And I wonder now, thinking about it even more, if that's an expenditure, like that ability to communicate, that he's in his final pushes communicating with Elend, even in a very sort of simplistic way as he's dying. Is that little bit of communication expending the last bits of his life and like effectively causing his death?
I think so. I think it's accelerating it at the very least.
Okay.
To that degree, in the way that he's, using what's left of his power and he's seeing everything being destroyed around him and has done his best. But, if we think about the way that like Preservation and Ruin butted up against each other, when Vin was holding that power, you can see how Ruin could have destroyed the person who was holding Preservation, because he didn't have all of that power. So Ruin was likely just directly attacking him, being like, ha, okay, well, buddy, I'm going to kill you now. And I really think that that's probably another thing that was going on in the background, right? Is that he was being directly attacked by Ruin as well.
And it's, textually known that Preservation couldn't attack in general.
Right. Could preserve himself, you would assume, if he had the power to do so. But
womp womp.
It's more like holding a shield. So with that, we go to chapter 78. These final episodes are always beefy boys, but this one's going to be particularly beefy, I'm feeling. So we've got our logbook here. Long one. There's a couple of long ones. There's a couple of short ones, but this is one of those long ones. It may seem odd to those reading this that Atium was part of the body of a god. However, it is necessary to understand that when we said body, we generally meant power. As my mind has expanded, I've come to realize that objects and energy are actually composed of the very same things and can change state from one to another. It makes perfect sense to me that the power of godhood would be manifest within the world in physical form. Ruin and Preservation were not nebulous abstractions. They were integral parts of existence. In a way, every object that existed in the world was composed of their power. Atium, then, was an object that was one-sided. Instead of being composed of half Ruin and half Preservation, as, say, a rock would be, Atium was completely of Ruin. The pits of Hathsin were crafted by Preservation as a place to hide the chunk of Ruin's body that he had stolen away during the betrayal and imprisonment. Kelsier didn't truly destroy this place by shattering those crystals, for they would have regrown eventually, in a few hundred years, and continued to deposit Atium as the place was a natural outlet for Ruin's trapped power. When people burned atium then, they were drawing upon the power of ruin, which is perhaps why atium turned people into such efficient killing machines. They didn't use up this power, however, but simply made use of it. Once a nugget of atium was expended, the power would return to the pits and begin to coalesce again, just as the power at the Well of Ascension would return there again after it had been used.
Mm-hmm. So I know it's well known and kind of established that everything in this world is equally ruin and preservation, but I hadn't quite taken that to mean objects and the planet itself. I took it to mean like beings and animals and plants and stuff, but those don't really exist in this world at this point, do they?
Correct. Isn't that, I mean, they do, right? Like plants do exist. Flowers don't, because obviously the plants feed. And
dogs exist.
Dogs exist. Like there are some animals, probably not to the, pervasive nature, because obviously that's something that gets repopulated in the world when Sazed takes the power.
Right. But I don't know. I just hadn't put enough thought into it to like really break it down. Like, oh, that rock is half ruin and half preservation when you really boil it down. So this kind of helped me refocus and reframe that to really kind of understand what's happening here. How it all works.
It's very interesting that they're both like equally invested into each of these components in the world. Like they have an equal contribution into everything that they do, right? Except for the one imbalance really being humanity.
And that was an explicit deal that they had to, like, you get to see why. When Vin tries to do anything, Ruin can block her. And you can see that like they have to work together in order to do anything, because one can just block the other from doing anything that they don't want. So it had to be an explicit like conversation and compromise and like a plan. It had to be planned out. It couldn't just be done by preservation without Ruin's knowledge of it.
I think that's another thing that makes this really interesting too, is that the blocking, Rune's ability to block preservation, is ultimately leading to the culmination of the destruction of the world, which is what was promised, right? Like this is the balance that the end was always supposed to come to based on the agreement. So like just by throwing his arms up and saying, you can't do anything, I can't really do that much, and then kind of blocking each other's impacts in the world, this is the culmination of the stone rolling downhill as it should.
Yeah, I kind of just imagine them at a certain point. They've just got like Adirondack chairs chilling. And they're like, I don't know, I can't do anything. You can't do anything.
One of those marshmallows, the guy or something, throwing out the chair, and they're both sitting there, but it's two of them.
Yeah, maybe they're bathtubs like those Viagra commercials. They're just sitting there in their bathtubs watching the Earth, watching the planet,
staring off as the planet explodes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. We move from the logbook over to the imprisonment of Sazed in the Khandra homeland in what he calls the strangest dungeon he'd ever been in. And that certainly makes sense considering the goo that was normally kept there. I guess like it can't rot. I guess it would just like grow stale. I don't know. The Khandra don't rot in the cells.
I'm imagining it like never drying out Play-Doh.
Okay.
In an open little container with grates on top.
But I fruit up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a good way of thinking about it. I like the imagery that he uses as he's talking about this chamber that he's trapped in, and he's like, oh, of course they wouldn't build something for humans. Humans have never been here before, so it just makes sense. But yeah. Our boy has finally come to Did you have something else to say there? Sorry.
Well, it's essentially a bucket.
Yeah, right. A hole in the ground bucket.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But our boy has finally come to terms with something serious from a religious standpoint. The hero is real, and he's feeling vindication and validation through his placing of faith for the first time in this novel. He believes in it, and it pulls something out of him where he can finally connect all the dots and, to quote, somehow drawing peace from chaos.
Yeah. I am struggling with this section. Like, I don't quite have the right way to describe how I'm feeling about it. So I'm going to just kind of word salad at you a little bit. Salad. Sazed's realization, or this decision, I guess, to believe that the world isn't ending and that the hero is real and that the terrorist faith is true. It feels like it's supposed to be that missing piece that was like what he was searching for all along. But it kind of feels forced in a way to me. He already believed that Vin was the hero of ages. He has no real reason to believe that the world isn't ending at this point. And the end of the world is also entirely foretold by this religion that he's choosing to believe in. And like, don't get me wrong, this is still a powerful moment and very important for Sazed to come to, but it just feels weird to me. Does that track? Does that make sense?
You're struggling with it in the same way that Brandon was, because he was like, it kind of jumps to conclusions here, and it's a little bit Deus Ex religion. I think his own words in regards to Sazed's feelings here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's good at least. At least I'm not just totally at odds with the writing of this. How'd you feel about it?
I'll talk about that in our wrap up. But okay. I pretty much agree with you. I think that there's a lot of this that is like, I love Sazed's arc on the whole, but totally. This is very much like a blindsiding that almost feels unnecessary considering what we're going to see happen in the last, and I don't mean when he picks up the powers. I mean when he goes out and confronts the fact that the hero is dead, right? That's what I mean. This is strangely like a step too far for me personally in terms of needing the validation or like having that circle around in his head in the wrong way. I agree with you. I kind of have the same mental word salad about this whole thing, because it's like he knows that the hero is true. The world is ending. The world should be saved by the hero. Well, the hero is going to come and save the world. Like, that's the circular nature of the faith, right? Like, so he has to believe that Vin is the hero. He already did believe that. So why isn't he connecting the dots? And or like,
why are there dots to be connected in the first place?
Right. Yeah. Part of me believes that this is put in to part of me believes that this was put in just to make sure that the reader got it. But in all honesty,
and to complete the arc, like this is him coming to the realization that like I'm in it now.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it was necessary.
I would agree with you. If it were me, I would cut these paragraphs. I think it is more confusing than it is necessary. I do like the idea that this is a solidification to make sure that you get that Sazed's on the right side of his faith. If you somehow weren't there before, how much repetition do we need to really get something or to understand something or to understand the rules of something, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That is a net complaint that I have, is often these books are a little repetitive in nature. And I'm not sure, by repetitive in nature, I mean, it's not, well, Sanderson wants to make sure you get it. And in a way that can be very demeaning to the audience if you take it that way. And that can be all kinds of things. That can be in the repetition of rules. It is definitely something that he learned from Robert Jordan. A big difference is Robert Jordan had a couple of years between books on average versus like annual releases, which is how this was released, or, you know. So I think it's tough to say because it's a good reminder of things as necessary, but, you know. Yeah. This is within the same book, though. This is the same concept repeated within the same book a couple of times, which also happens. So, like, I think I'd complained about this at the beginning of The Well of Ascension, but it's like, here's our quick reminder of how all the rules work of Allomancy within the first 30 pages when we had to kill a bunch of people. And then again, in the beginning of this book, when we had the first city that we were in, it's like, you could almost entirely cut that first city from a writing perspective if you didn't need to remind people about the rules.
Well, it wasn't just the rules, though. It was also the storage caverns.
You could have introduced that in any other number of ways. We already found one. We already know. We found 4 before this. Wow. That's my point. Like,
yeah,
he is using it to introduce plot beats and other things like that. It's just again, third pass in a year. So, but we'll talk about that more later.
Yeah.
So fair. I do feel like it's unnecessary. I get why it's here.
Mm-hmm.
It's on my book. And so Sazed begins to take this time to store his forces in his metal mines. We feel him really kind of slowing down, becoming sick again. I really just like this little bit where it's kind of like we get all of the little bits of, here's the fatigue, here's the loss of sight, here's the kind of going into the meditation. It's a great, funny enough, it's a great reminder of how ferrochemy works. In case you don't remember.
Well, I think it's
actually
more
feeling
than that, though. Thing. Because it is kind of a new thing that we're seeing, because it's not a dedicated object that he's storing things into. It's the grates in his cell.
Mm-hmm.
So he's just sitting there like this until a guard comes and he's like, oh no, I'm just fine. And then he's like meditating again. And I know that was a visual gag and this is an audio platform, but I think you got what I was doing. I was holding on to monkey bars, more or less. I just found that super cool. But it is just strength, or strength and weight, right? Or speed and weight, I think are the two.
That sounds right.
Yeah. Because he doesn't have his metal mines at this point. They're
correct.
On a bag that he has to collect later.
Yeah. He specifically says often when filling many, he would drift, and then that's how he drifts. But he's touching two different metals, which I think is speed and weight. Iron and steel. Yeah. Because there's a steel lock and then there's a iron grate. So he's like,
because those are the two powers he uses. He like crushes. We'll get there in the fight scene, but he like crushes some dude. And then he like, I love the description of ferrochemy in fights. It's fun.
It's very cool because it has so much more nuance than allomancy does in a lot of ways, and the trade-offs are more dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
So, but while he drifts in and out of meditating, he is stirred by a young Khandra, Milan, Tensoon's adopted daughter of sorts, of whom is there to bust him out, along with her beloved father back in his wolfhound body. It also, once again, finds Sazed at the center of a revolution, albeit a much smaller one. This guy doesn't know how to stay out of conflict at all, ever, I'm beginning to think.
No.
He's the center of it all.
Yeah, it's almost like he's destined to become some world-renowned hero or something.
It's like he's a warrior? A king who didn't want to be? Someone who's kind of shaken off of his own people? Weird.
What? I am very happy here to have Tensoon and Milan reunited.
Mm-hmm.
I also really like Sazed's description of the Seventh's bodies, or true bodies, as deviant. I think that's a great way to put them.
Mm-hmm.
They're all fucked up.
It's like, that's weird. That's not
that one's got 4 arms.
Yeah.
That one's a dog.
Well, he knows the dog, you know. Fair point. Cool. And these Khandra, however, are looking to throw off the reins of the seconds and the insistence therein to serve the seconds. What do you think about the philosophical shift of the Khandra, even if it was here at the last minute? What do you make of this sort of change of the youths, as it were?
Ironically, I don't think it's a change, because the seconds are throwing off the structure. And even though they're doing it for what they believe are the right reasons for the Khandra people, these are people creatures of structure and patience and habit and preservation. So the fact that there is a coup and things are getting shaken up, it is natural in my mind that they would be pushing against that change, despite the idea that it's better.
That's a fair point. Okay, I guess, so thinking about the seconds, they're throwing a coup to the status quo, to like a particular clause basically in the original contract, right? Like that's what they're doing effectively.
Yeah.
And then we're getting a coup on top of that coup with the other generations for the most part. We'll call it the seventh, most like a third, sevenths, the fifths are still kind of like muscle for the seconds. There's some rogues here and there. I guess the new uprising, the second coup, not the
it's fighting against the first coup, right? Like, so it's,
but the coup of the seconds is the first coup. You know what I mean? Like that's what I was.
That's what I'm saying. The sevenths are fighting against that coup, even though it's already basically happened.
Yeah, but they're still fighting for something different than what the firsts represented. That's my point. That's what I was trying to say, is that like they don't want to go back to the contract to serve humans. They're still following the contract. They agree to follow the contract at the end of this chapter as the resolution happens and occurs. But I guess my point is like, what do you think of that philosophical shift where they're like, no more humans, and like all of the other kind of stuff of like no more being under the control of humans, throwing off a lot of these things that the Lord Ruler had placed on them? That's really the difference that I was trying to pick at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because Sazed remarks on how strange it is that they're talking about humans here.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's interacting with Tensoon after returning from being gone, not on contract, and seeing how he's able to navigate the landscape and be fine and return, and seemingly to a certain extent is kind of thriving despite going against that contract.
Yeah. That is
rather not being on contract.
I guess like that is a true reality here that we're seeing. I guess my thought was more like how do I put this?
It's certainly complicated.
It's tough to talk about too, because there are just so many numbers to throw around to talk about all the different occurrences as they happen. I guess my thought is like the Khandra are throwing off the reins of the old regime. We'll call it that way. They're looking here to upheave the process that they lived by before entirely. And while this is kind of a short-lived process here, this philosophical shift is really interesting because it speaks to an undercurrent of people that we'd kind of hinted at before, from the thirds on, and some other rogue generations had kind of thought, about the contract as a bad thing. I guess if there was a future for the Khandra, how do you see that playing out? That's kind of more what I was going for. Does that make sense? Like, if this coup was successful and they implemented and they did the things, what do you see the future of the Khandra being? No longer subservient to humans. I guess it's the really big thing.
I think they'd just be people. I think that's the only way to take that, because so much like they were created for a very particular task. And now that's irrelevant, and the sort of subterfuge to like hide the fact that they have a very particular class or task was another very particular class or task.
Yeah.
And now both of those things are gone in this scenario. So what are they but people? People that can imitate other people. Actors? Could they be entertainers of some sort? I think it would just be a society that lives and grows on its own, taking on true bodies and living amongst the population. But there's always going to be that innate fear of them because of what they have the capability of doing naturally in absorbing and imitating people's bodies, which is, I don't know, maybe white collar crime. Maybe they lead crime families. I don't know. I'm having trouble like figuring out what them as a unified society would really represent other than just being there.
Sure. Okay. And you think that I think that is a thing, that is a potential future. So I mean, I don't discount that. I was just curious as to which direction you think they'd go. If they'd be antagonistic, if they'd be like a kind of a regular group of folk, which it kind of sounds like.
I mean, I think there'd be a lot of just hostility and misunderstanding that would have to be addressed on a society scale from both sides, because there's going to be disdain and like remembering that they've been enslaved and tortured to a certain extent by these people that they're now expected to go live amongst peacefully. And at the same time, the people see them as monsters. So how do you effectively get them to live together other than very slow, progressive introductions and education? It's going to take a long time.
It is going to take a long time. I think that's a great point. And they're immortal. Like, that's the other thing that's so different about them versus even humanity, is like on their time frame, on their time scale, they face very different the longevity of an individual is just so different. It just makes for a very different cultural analysis when you've got this group of immortals and what their world will look like or could look like, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously we don't see that. because of how the rest of this chapter goes, but you know, curious. We do get some excellent moments here. We'll talk about that more in a second. But we get some excellent moments here of Sazed fighting, like you were saying, using up what he stored in his metal mines. The metal mines being the metals that he keyed to him when he used the ferrochemical powers on the lock and the grate, which was really cool, as well as manipulating lightness here to kind of float around them. It's fascinating what a ferrochemist can manage, and excellent to see as he topples some Fifth Guard meatheads in the process. It's just so cool to see this. Like, it's a much more creative system as opposed to Allomancy. Almost feels, it's so weird. It's weird to say this. I feel like Allomancy almost feels like cheating because it makes you such an effective killing machine, versus this is like creative mechanics to solve a problem. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like, there's more direct power with Allomancy, but Feruchemy has this like tangible side effect.
Yeah, it's very problem solving. Mm-hmm. And yeah,
it's more like a chemical reaction than Allomancy is to me. Like, you've got balancing agents on either side.
Okay, I can see that.
You have to balance your equation, you know? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I've made the stoichiometry comparison a couple of times.
Yeah, I think you have. Because it works. It makes sense. What I like about this scene, more than even that, is the fact that he has to, forgive me, tap dance through this. Because he's tapping the metal mines through his feet in the grate that he's standing on. So he has to like stay in place, and it's this really strange imagery of like, I don't know, like having to stay stationary while going through this very intense fight scene. Mm-hmm. Kind of fun.
Yeah, it's very cool.
I'm assuming he's able to hold the lock itself, but the grate, he's like specifically like tapping with his feet.
Mm-hmm. It has a very Avatar: The Last Airbender feel in some like very tough ways that I enjoy. But he's got to be holding the lock. Like, that's my assumption.
I would think so.
Yeah,
because it had to come off in order for him to get out. So why would he like put it back on the ground? He wouldn't, is the answer. But this is also where he starts to realize like they're able to kind of brush off any piercing or slashing. They're like, oh, that's why they have hammers.
Right.
Like, crushing.
That's why they use the hammers to crush bones as opposed to stabbing, because that's the type of combat that they need to do against each other if they had to. Yeah, which is also why they're dispatched kind of jokingly in a bit. So we end this chapter with finding out that the firsts have been locked up and had been replaced by older gooballs, of whom were being tortured here, as well as Tensoon setting up a ploy to trick the seconds, and this gives Sazed the opportunity to talk to the firsts one last time. However, we don't see it, so...
Yep, that's missing. Annoyingly.
Anyway.
That was a genius way to hide the firsts, and I can't help but make the comparison to how the Lord Ruler hid the Trustborn right next to the pits. Like, nobody's going to look here. Nobody's going to look there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, talk to the first. Gib talk.
Gib talk. Gib deets. You know, and I get it. I do want to say I level a lot of thoughts, complaints from time to time about this book, and I will, in the end, in our Hero of Ages summary episode, be a little bit more solid in those versus kind of hinting at them here. But it is important to say that there's also a real constraint on the publishing process here. It was his first series. So at the same time, like, he only has so much wiggle room, so much give that he could do. And I think with the time, room, and everything provided, all of the circumstance and constraints, the story is great. So I need to give it that credit. However, I do miss some things in my dream state of, you know, what storytelling can be. Right. I imagine if this were adapted into a TV series, of which I would prefer over a movie, Mother of God. If that isn't clear by the time you get to, like, Mistborn, totally a movie. The first book, Final Empire, totally a movie. The
whole series, one movie.
Balcony is only 3 stories up. I don't know if I'd break my neck. I'm just kidding. No, absolutely not. First one could be a movie. The second 2 cannot be movies. There's simply too much ground to cover to make it feel good. And you'd gain the benefit of exploring some of these very obvious things that are like right there that just need a little bit more of a tug or a push. So this is a great example. Chapter 79 here. We have our logbook. Again, it's a long book. Let it be known, when we decided to start reading all of these, I thought it was a great idea. And the original books, they're short, they're nice, they're easy. I forgot how long they get. And now for consistency's sake, we're locked in to doing this. It's a very strange thing to have even a talking point be about, but the logbooks take up a shocking amount of time when you look at our total runtime. It's important that we talk about them because they're, just as important as any other page of the story. But like, dude, that's a lot of time compared to other like books being able to focus on characters and other things like that. So it's another thing picking at my brain. Okay. 79's logbook. I believe that the Mists were searching for someone to become a new host for them. The power needed a consciousness to direct it. In this matter, I am still rather confused. Why would power used to create and destroy need a mind to oversee it? And yet, it seems to only have a vague will of its own, tied to the mandate of its abilities. Without a consciousness to direct it, nothing could actually be created or destroyed. It's as if the power of preservation understands that its tendency to reinforce stability is not enough. If nothing changed, nothing would ever come to exist. That makes me wonder who or what the minds of preservation and ruin were. Regardless, the Mists, the power of preservation, chose someone to become their host long before all of this happened. That someone, however, was immediately seized by Ruin and used as a pawn. He must have known that by giving her a disguised hemorrhagic spike, he would keep the Mists from investing themselves in her as they wished. The 3 times she drew upon their power, then, were the 3 times when her earring had been removed from her body. When she had fought the Lord Ruler, his allomancy had ripped it free. When fighting Marsh and Fadrix, she had used the earring as a weapon. And, at the end, Marsh ripped it out, freeing her and allowing the Mists, which were now desperate for a host since Preservation's last wisp was gone, to finally pour themselves into her.
Okay. So, what this does not explain is why Vin specifically has to be the one. Couldn't they have... Oh, I guess they came to the decision together, didn't they?
Together and apart, right? It was because Ruin noticed Preservation investing in her that he decided that he needed to chase her down. So because of the careful plans of Preservation to line up a lot of these details, that's why Ruin then influences the mother to kill her daughter, to give the spike so that he could control the vessel, the intended vessel for the power.
Okay. Fair. Totally fair.
Like 40 chests in 2 directions.
There is the other comment that Sazed makes about not quite understanding why the power would need consciousness to control it. And I think that can be very easily explained by what they've been talking about this entire goddamn time, that the power is the body. And those are interchangeable. And a body is nothing without a conscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Yeah. It's not as though the power then becomes directionless. It just is. And so I think that that's important to say that, like, you could... I think, comparatively, Preservation did a really good job breaking himself up well enough that the power would have continued and did continue for a while without a body. However, it wasn't able to act and intervene on anyone's particular behalf outside of the plans and expectations and intents that had been set earlier. And so its intent couldn't change because it didn't have someone to change it. Versus Ruin could directly influence it and be like, well, you're on autopilot over there because you're gone, you're dead, and I can do whatever the fuck I want to circumvent your autopilot that you tried to set up.
Right.
So, which you would think that Sazed would draw that conclusion. But at this point, this is where I think the logbook can get a little bit weaker because it's feeding us information about the story that Sazed should know because he holds the powers and can understand precisely, but the story still needs to give us enough to leave that dramatic moment to allow it to happen. And so this is almost the only thing in the entire book that feels very inconsistent.
It feels inconsistent, but also it feels like we have that information at this point already. Like, there's not a reveal that makes that make more sense later.
Right.
So why make it ambiguous?
Agreed. I think the thing that it's making ambiguous is the bit that we're talking about. It is strictly talking about, obviously, when the mists flew in and why. So, like, that's not up for question. It's more the sort of intent that we're talking about, and the reason that Sazed doesn't know, and we know that Sazed fucking knows by the end. So there's some weird things that happen around this time, which makes this in particular, I talked to Lindsay about it. This in particular is the section that Lindsay was the most frustrated with the logbook, because so much of the story is very dependent on the logbook revealing information to us versus natural context.
Right. Agreed.
So
I agree with her completely.
Yeah. So we return to Vin, of whom is continuing to give us a shining lens through which to view the foundational power of the world. She lauds the Lord Ruler's plan. And now that we know all that we know, what do you make of the Lord Ruler and his efforts? Like, we're here at the end. We can see the influence of preservation through his actions. What do you think about the Lord Ruler now?
I think we've been talking about this for a long time. We've especially been talking about the comparisons to how the Lord Ruler operated and how Elend has been operating throughout the story. I feel like most of those arguments are still very valid, but I also still have to agree that some of those transgressions were unnecessary. But overall, he was acting consistently in trying to preserve the planet and the people on it. It's got to be a crazy burden to carry, especially understanding that this was all conscious. Yeah, it's still tough to wrestle with, and it's still a moral philosophical quandary to argue whether or not it was purely evil with each individual action taken, despite the overall goal.
I do want to just briefly touch on that a little bit here. That is a great analysis of the whole entirety of the Lord Ruler, and I think that entirely valid and definitely a great point, and I agree with holistically. I did want to focus here a little bit more. My intent, I should say, with the question was to focus a little bit more on the missteps that the Lord Ruler made right at the beginning with the power, like the things that he did on accident in comparison to Vin, because now we have an understanding of how easy it is to fuck up.
Yeah, honestly, this becomes easier to discuss, I think, when Sazed starts fixing things, because he has the context and the knowledge to operate within and like place the world back where it's supposed to be because of the star charts and all of his religious knowledge. But as far as Vin goes, she sees how easy it is to fuck up, makes us realize how easy it was for Lord Ruler to fuck up. But the Lord Ruler wasn't quite blocked on fixing those fuck-ups like Vin is in this moment. And I'm assuming that's because at that time, Ruin's already trapped and can't exert the same force that Vin is able to right now. Is that kind of the sort of conversation you're looking for?
I think that's totally what I was looking for. Obviously, the Lord Ruler didn't face the same conflict with Ruin that Vin did or does right now actively, because he was trapped in the well, but he did still face that balancing force to some degree. So, no, that's entirely what I was aiming for that time. And I totally agree with you. I do want to say, I appreciate your full retrospective on the Lord Ruler on the whole. Totally also great. And definitely all of that stays. I was just thinking in particular as we think about the power, because that's where we're at with Ben. Okay. And yeah, I think that, like you said, I have a lot more respect for what the Lord Ruler managed, given that kind of crunchy time frame with the power.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Even if he
makes you wonder what kind of information he had in order to make those decisions and know, like, hey, I've got to open up the ash mounts so it stays cooler. Like, where do you get that information from?
And it seems to beg that, like, a lot of this is kind of Ruin's fault, like, despite the adjustments. And then, you know, in the end, the Lord Ruler is trying to fix the damage in the same way that the tidal wave and Vin, you know, similar consequence action chain. So we go from that moment with Vin into a quick blink and you'll miss it 2 paragraphs. Elend returning to his troops, beginning to lay the groundwork for what we'll see over the next couple of chapters, returning to lead those few that he sent away earlier, the Mistfallen.
I think this speaks very highly of Elend and his character, specifically because of how instantly he recognized, what were they? They were just guards, I guess. They were acting as guards, as members of his army that he had sent away. I don't have a whole lot to go off other than that, because you're right, it's a very quick little injection.
I think Brandon also wrote about this in the annotations, but the send chunk here has a very firm feel that grounds it, very similar to the way that a movie is edited. Like, this is cut, jump, cut, jump, cut, jump. And it very much has this sensation of watching something unfold, very similar to how a movie climax would unfold. And he's doing that intentionally. He's utilizing that and kind of using it as best he can inside of the medium.
Yeah.
And that's definitely not a criticism, for the record, or even like for those of you at home that think I'm just a critic. Just kidding.
No, I love it.
No, I really like it too. I think that it's great. I think that it's an interesting thing that you don't find until the pervasiveness of movies. And I think that's kind of what he begs the question of, like, writing is different because we have movies. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I don't know, but it's how I think about things. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, works. I mean, not to say anything about Joe Abercrombie, right? But the way he literally was a film editor, like, that was his job. And so, fantastic writer, was a fucking film editor. So, like, the way that he thinks about and constructs scenes is very much like how a film editor would think about constructing a story. It's fascinating.
It sounds cool.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
Sure.
We move to Sazed, and the Kandra are moving back into place to take back what's theirs when Tensoon is suddenly seized and turns back on his friend, attacking him and choking him. I find the comedy here when Sazed's being choked very odd. It's not that it isn't real, but the lightness with which Sazed approaches this shock and surprise is really... I'll stick with odd. Sazed can hear the call for the resolution, of course, and blacks out while many of the Kandra go for their spikes. What do you think about this moment?
I agree with you. The comedy was odd. What I do appreciate here is that we've already been exposed to Tensoon's ability to oppose this control, like he did with Zane and Vin. And I'm assuming... I feel like it's safe to assume that this is due to one of his blessings, specifically the one that, like, fortifies his mental capacities. I can't remember what it's called, though. Do you remember?
Presence.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm assuming that has to do with why he's able to kind of break out a little bit and give Sazed a warning of what's going on. Much like he was able to warn Vin subtly about how to break the contract.
I think it's also a part of the reason that Tensoon is controlled first is because he has 3 spikes in him. He has more than most Kandra do, right? So
that's
his set of spikes, I think that's why he's grabbed and not like Milan or someone else, as control is wrested from them. I think that it is easiest for Ruin to grab onto Tensoon, and so he does. I think that logically makes the most sense and isn't something that's talked about at all inside of the book, but I think we can infer pretty easily. Cool. All right, with that, we go into chapter 80. We've got our long book here. The Kandra people always said they were of preservation, while the Colossan Inquisitors were of ruin. Yet the Kandra bore hemalurgic spikes, just like the others. Was their claim then simple delusion? No, I think not. They were created by the Lord Ruler to be spies. When they said such things, most of us interpreted that as meaning he planned to use them as spies in his new government, because of their ability to imitate other people. Indeed, they were used for this purpose. But I see something more grand in their existence. They were the Lord Ruler's double agents, planted with hemalurgic spikes, yet trusted, taught, bound to pull them free when Ruin tried to seize them. In Ruin's moment of triumph, when he'd always assumed the Kandra would be his on a whim, the vast majority of them immediately switched sides and left him unable to seize his prize. They were of preservation all along.
So, I like that description, and I like that explanation. What I don't like about that is it goes against what we've been operating under assumption-wise, that the Lord Ruler didn't understand the connection between hemalurgy and ruin. Because we had talked about that a couple times in the past. And now it seems like he was completely aware and like used it against him. And that, I don't like that.
I think the rationale there is that it's his third and final creation, right? So it's like he didn't know what he was doing.
But he uses it himself too. Like he keeps hemalurgic spikes in himself.
So that he could live forever. In part. And could have more powers. Like, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Fair. Fine.
Fine is the way that I feel about it as well, for the record. There's a lot of things that are just like, this logbook is particularly grating as we get closer to the end of the story, because it is giving us reveals or moments like this. And I think a more nuanced way of saying this is like, these were the terrorist people. They were always in preservation, right? And so they knew, because they were this deeper combination of preservation and ruin, it made sense for them to be more of preservation than of ruin in the same way, so they could pull their spikes, trained, blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff fits. But the timing that we're being reminded of this information also makes me believe, again, that Brandon doesn't trust the readers to put this together entirely in this moment on their own. Does that make sense? Again, yeah. Like, it's a lot of this final logbook is like reiterating things like, did you get it? I feel like it's a lot of, did you get it? This isn't, I'm not trying to gotcha you. And it's like, no, I got it. I did get it. I swear.
So I think that can be forgiven based on the reason this logbook exists in the first place.
Right. Yes.
It's not written for the readers, hypothetically, quote unquote. It's written for spook.
Yes, entirely.
So I get that. And yeah, the point that Lord Ruler got his ferrochemy through hemalurgy explains it enough. But
right. Yeah. It does. And, you know, another point to push on there is that he implanted the metal mines also so that they couldn't be fucked with by other allomancers. So like there were a lot of things going on there that the Lord Ruler was trying to use to assert his dominance, because the only way that you could pull something out of someone in the end, as we find, is with something like a duralumin push, is something that is empowered beyond conventional allomancy that was available at the time. You would need a purer form of allomancy.
Or an enhanced one with hemalurgy.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you can get that sense of like he was using it kind of to be extra godly. I actually don't think he requires hemalurgy to live forever. I think I said that incorrectly. I believe it's a compounding effective.
He does. Because he doesn't have ferrochemy to begin with.
He does have ferrochemy to begin with.
He did.
Yeah.
Alendi didn't.
Correct. Yes, because Alendi was Kaleni.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So then what's just being more powerful, really?
Yeah, ensuring his survival, his own preservation, right? Like, by being more powerful than everyone else. And because he actually knows what he's going up against in the form of ruin, I can see that hubris a little bit. He didn't realize how it was going to wear on him over 1,000 years. And he could have pulled out the spikes. It's not like he's an inquisitor who's surviving because of the spikes. He just felt strong enough that, you know, there are a couple of rationales there, but
yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. All right. I read the logbook. The book returns to Elend after he has found Demu and begin to figure out what can be done here for the people, but they already have hope. While I, reading this, feel a sense of like panic in this moment, the terroristmen and the army have come together despite the misfortune in Luthadel under Penrod. And then there's another bit, that of the survivor leading them here to begin with, and how that faith is also propelling them. Like, this feels very stable compared to a lot of the rest of the story we're experiencing in this moment. This feels hopeful, despite the ever-present end of the world that we're kind of subsumed with.
Yeah. Thinking about this now, would you agree that it feels fair to say that the Church of the Survivor is somehow unintentionally a sect of the terrorist religion?
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. They don't worship. Fair. Well, no. Says it's not even on their clock. You know?
True. But, yeah. No, you're right. Good point.
But, like, I get what you're saying. I just don't think that they align quite so cleanly. Like, they do have similar tenets, I guess, kind of, or they have overlapping points, but I don't think that they're like a sect of the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. You're right. You're right.
Like,
you've convinced me. You're right.
Yeah. It's tough because I don't want to completely shit on that, but I do really think that worshiping Kelsier is completely different than worshiping the hero, the eventual hero. There is a question there though that is like, what does the terrorist religion look like post the hero? Like, this religion foretells a hero showing up. What's your post text? Which is very similar to, I mean, if you are a Christian, it is very similar to the way that Judaism and like the Old Testament is then moved forward into Christianity with the New Testament and the coming of Jesus and blah, blah. What do we do after we live, after a survivor comes, etc. Like, that's all.
But regardless, this
gets into like
faith is based on like a cycle, though, isn't it?
I think that is a ruin manipulation.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. I don't think it was ever intended to be cyclical. I think that is a textual manipulation by Ruin to convince that the hero comes and goes, to point to Rashek, to then point to Vin, to say, let me out of my prison.
I'm down with that.
As opposed to the original faith, of which, as we get from the firsts, doesn't point to a cycle at all.
Mm-hmm.
So,
cool.
Yeah. We cut, of course, to Sazed waking up to most of the Conjure being reverted themselves, or having reverted themselves, rather, into goo-like mist wraiths, bones placed without intelligence or design that these creatures just minutes before had. It's sad to see them turn back into this unconscious mass, kind of squiggling and splurting around on the floor. But at the same time, this was like their end objective. This was their trade for immortality. Turns out it was only 1,000 years, but, you know.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about that. Still, I really was hoping for something more unexpected to happen when they removed the spikes. But instead, it is exactly what they assumed would happen. With the one maybe clarification that you could make, but maybe unknown. What happens if they get re-spiked? Do they come back to sentience in the same way that they were before, with the same memories, with the same brain, with the same thoughts? Or do they return to sentience as a different Kandra?
It's a great question.
And is the Mist Wraith the immortal being that was promised, as opposed to the Kandra themselves? Because they were explicitly turned into Mist Wraiths with immortality and then spiked and turned into Kandra.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably with immortality, but this clause.
It's a great question. Yeah. There's always another secret.
There's always another secret.
There's always another secret. But, of course, that isn't all of them, meaning all of the Mist Wraiths, not all of the secrets. Any of them have survived. At least 20 here that are working, 20 of the Kandra, I should say, that are working to pop open the Trust Warren to let Ruin get to the ATM. And so Sazed gets all of his metal mines out, but grabs two in particular and locks the Kandra into the room with his strength and weight holding against the door. Hold the door. I'll
never complain about Ferric mechanics. I love seeing them written down and explained so much.
Yeah, I think that ferrochemy is the superior system. I prefer Ferrochemy to Allomancy. I think that Allomancy is great, but again, it's like a bunch of flashy card tricks and, is explained by expending the resource in your stomach. I get it. It's got a balance. It's cool. It's got its takes and ebbs and flows. It's got its gives. I get it. I get the rules. Don't yell at me. But I do prefer Ferrochemy's very outlined, delineated restrictions more, personally.
Yeah. I think I agree.
Because it's not just the rate at which a metal burns is so abstract, but the idea of needing to spend time lethargic without senses or whatever to then expend it in bursts, much more reasonable. My brain can handle it.
Yeah.
It's like after a nap, I can run further.
Especially considering that some metals burn faster than others.
Right. Yeah. It's like, what's
true.
faster mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
And at what point do we get down to I need an equation of how quickly a block of pewter this big would burn, so then I can equate that to, and it just gets silly at a certain point, because it is so scientifically written and scientifically minded that it just ends up being you can just keep scratching at it, and I want to keep scratching at it until I get to the very bottom because it is so well defined. Versus Ferrochemy, it kind of already feels like we're at the bottom in a good way. It feels like I have everything with Ferrochemy, except for maybe some unknown metals. But yeah.
And the one thing that I do want more out of Ferrochemy is the logic behind it not being usable by other Ferrochemists.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, why can't that be accessed? So. It's a great question. Maybe we'll get there.
Maybe.
Who knows?
Who knows? You do.
Well, at a certain point, we're going to hit books where it's going to be there are questions still. I don't know, kind of like we did with Red Rising. And the problem is that those books that may pose those questions, there are 7 books that are left to be written in the series, probably over 20 years. What? Okay, moving on. Elend begins to hear whispers like he had heard before and finds it odd, cursing, and then realizing that it's been leading him and his soldiers to exactly where they need to be. He makes it to the Trust Warren and just easily owns the translucent Khandra that are there, easily, breaking true bodies and reverting the Khandra to gelatin. He comes to realize not the power of the metal within, but Venture focuses on how he could get people in here so that they could, of course, survive.
Yeah. In this moment, that's the more important goal, really. He is a man of the people. He doesn't have the perspective of this God fight,
Right.
This is true to who he always has been. Someone who cares about the people that he's in charge of. So I would be upset that he would suddenly know about the ATM being that important for that reason. But B, I'd be upset that he would go against his character in such a way if he were to do that. So
yeah, I think it's a great moment to reinforce that Elend is for the people first and always has been, right? Especially since we know where he ends. At this point, we can point back at this and be Elend, in the end, did manage to combine all of the different sides of his personality into a force to be reckoned with that focused on people first. I do think it's interesting that the focus here is obviously on getting the people in to survive, but this comes into conflict with my thought about his faith in the Church of the Survivor. And I don't think it's talked about enough in this book for us to really spend a whole lot of time on. It's maybe once or twice that Demu pushes back on it. But also the faith itself is so amorphous as survival as the goal that it's odd. I don't know how much more I can add to that conversation outside of that, if that makes sense. But
no, I'm with you.
Feels like there's something there to scratch at, but I'm not sure that it would reveal anything.
Mm-hmm. I don't think there's enough connective tissue to really dig in.
Right. Cool. All right. With that, We're in chapter 81, baby. This is the long chapter. This is the big fat boy, and that includes a big fat logbook. Snapping has always been the dark side of allomancy. A person's genetic endowment may make them a potential allomancer, but in order for the power to manifest, the body must be put through extraordinary trauma. Though Elend spoke of how terrible his beating was during our day, unlocking allomancy in a person was easier than it had once been, for we had the infusion of preservation's power into the human bloodlines via the nuggets granted to the nobility by the Lord Ruler. I want to pause there. That is why Alendi definitely had abilities, but it wasn't snapped until much later, right? This is why he was able to be snapped, is because the reason that snapping was so easy in the Final Empire versus how hard it was before, which is why Alendi was probably the very first allomancer on record for a long fucking time.
That makes sense.
Just wanted to say that. So, going back to the logbook, when Preservation set up the mist, he was afraid of Rune escaping his prison. In those early days before the Ascension, the mist began to snap people as they did during our time. But this action of the mist was one of the only ways to awaken allomancy in a person, for the genetic attributes were buried too deeply to be brought out by a simple beating. The mists of that day created mistings only, of course. There were no mistborn until the Lord Ruler made use of nuggets. The people misinterpreted the mist's intent, as the process of snapping allomancers caused some, particularly the young and old, to die. This hadn't been Preservation's desire, but he'd given up most of his consciousness to form Rune's prison, and the mists had to be left to work as best they could without specific direction, intent like we were saying before. Rune, subtle as ever, knew that he couldn't stop the mists from doing their work. However, he could do the unexpected and encourage them, and so he helped make them stronger. That brought death to the plants of the world and created the threat that became known as the Deepness.
I appreciate this explanation more than a lot of them so far. I think it answers a ton of the questions that we've had throughout the story and throughout last week specifically. It explains the death to a certain extent. I wish it would have just been, yeah, they were misborn, but oops, didn't get them pewter in time. That could have been fun to explore as a concept. But yeah, I like this overall.
I really like this one too. I think that this is a great thing that isn't explained by the text previously. And it's a great, like we were kind of putting, like I put together in the middle there, like this is the proof that Alendi was an allomancer. This is how this gives us context to a lot of things, like why Mistborn couldn't have existed beforehand, why they were never reported in Quan's journal or diaries, and a number of different components that otherwise wouldn't have been touched on. This chapter exposes a lot of information in a, we had talked about the previous chapters, kind of like, I don't know, this is way too harsh, but like making a fool of the reader to some degree, or like kind of feeling a little bit demeaning if you didn't catch something. This is the opposite of that, where this is much more of a grounded explanation as to something that we may not have gotten otherwise. Like, why was it called the Deepness? Like, what was this? And this is more like, hey, here are these details that do not make sense to talk about necessarily in the plot right now, but Sazed would have access to because he's the hero of ages and has access to all of this information and knowledge in the depths of the power's attributes. Yeah. All right, on into the chapter itself. I find it very interesting that Rune is the big talker here, while Vin is more focused on using her powers as opposed to enumerating his plan further, and kind of like operating, and he's just kind of giving away the information like we were saying earlier. He keeps giving up more and more and more and more pieces of different information, including an incredibly important number that hundreds of thousands of Koloss are coming, charging toward Elend and the few hundred soldiers that he has, rather.
I was wondering when this would become relevant. And I appreciate truly that we got a glimpse of this from Marsh's perspective earlier on in the book. I think without that, this would have felt pretty cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, suddenly, giant fucking army. Sorry. But the fact that this had been established and it had always been kind of in the back of our minds a little bit. Yeah, that felt good.
As we get to the end of the story here, I appreciate how Marsh is like the Swiss Army knife of the plot beats in a lot of ways. Like, he connects us to Penrod. He connects us to the death of Goridel, which then gets us to the conclusion with Vin, which, like, it's all of these small little things. And he very much is that interconnective. If you had like a conspiracy wall with a bunch of photos on it, he would be the red line connecting all of the dots in a big way, which in turn means that it's kind of Rune's downfall. I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
From a perspective point, yeah. So, man, and the world as painted by Vin's godly sight gives us this impression of destruction that reminds me of those slice of the world and like geographical features maps that we had like back in elementary school, where you see like mountains and archipelagos on the same continent with like islands and waterfalls and volcanoes, and then you see desert and like all of these different, locations kind of blending in together. It just reminds me of that because you have this extra extracted view. It's just it's just so vast that it's almost hard to discern anything beyond the general destruction, and especially given the way that she's interacted with the world, incidentally causing more and more and more of this chaos and destruction herself. So she decides to do something else and slams the powers together, forcing a direct clash between her and Ruin.
Yeah, I had brought up that tidal wave earlier, probably crushing another city that we're not aware of and potentially another kingdom that we're not aware of. But this really just makes me wonder how many more little or large societies are around this planet that we're not made aware of. Is that addressed and I'm just missing it?
No.
Okay. Cool.
The only other thing that's mentioned, I think in a logbook at some point in this book, is life on the poles.
Okay. So life on the poles and city crushed by tsunami. Right?
Yeah.
But we don't necessarily know if that city is within the central dominance or the dominance.
It may have been in the previous book. It's definitely...
I do remember life on the poles.
Yeah.
But maybe I just remember it from you saying it. I don't know.
No, it's definitely... Yeah, it's definitely in Well of Ascension. Okay. But regardless, the point being here that it is interesting that we only sit here for the most part. So,
and seemingly Ruin and Preservation spend a lot of their time here.
Yes. So it does beg the question of, is there anything else anywhere else? Where was that tidal wave headed? Did it was that, because we know that there are cities on the coast on this continent, and we also know that there are other continents, kind of. We get that illusion when we go to Sazed's perspective, for sure. So, Yeah, interesting. We go back to Elend and Sazed having a final conversation about what is to be done about the atium. Sazed believes that Vin will come, as she is the hero of ages, the one who will arrive to save the people, especially considering this dwindling army of under 1,000 troops, kind of doesn't look very good. I want to talk more about them in a second, specifically about Faith, but here we see the revelation that these men aren't conventional allomancers, but all of them are seers who can burn atium.
Yeah. Great bit of information. I'm still confused by the atium and how it fits into everything. And it's strictly of Ruin, not of Preservation. So how can the mists impart that power into somebody? Yeah. And how is it not under the influence of Preservation?
Allomancy is the ability to burn metals.
Okay. And that's what...
sense. Ferrochemy is the ability to store things in metals. Hemalurgy is the ability to, granted by killing people and stealing their powers with metal, basically.
Okay. So then it's just a matter of creating the metals that can be burned.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Or that certain metals are burnable,
Right.
Because some metals are not, so... or don't result in powers that we know or are aware of. So,
gotcha. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I think this book does a pretty good job of pointing to the fact that that atium and malatium don't fit on the regular chart because they are Ruin's body.
So does that... You mentioned that last week, and then rethinking about it, I tried to make sense of that. Does that mean they're not one of the 16?
Correct.
Okay. So then, why is it still 16 like 1 in 16
that's a great question.
Are affected.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Maybe there's a different answer. There's always another secret. So many 16s that have been painstakingly set up in this world. So, yeah, PJ is flipping me off and rolling them like dice. Totally.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so they can all burn A team. Pretty neat. Demue and Sazed's faith, though, here is interesting to juxtapose, I think. One believes in the coming of a hero to save them in a dire hour, and the other believes in a man who inspired them through his sheer will to survive, despite all odds. But they're at dramatically different points here inside of their religious faiths, right? Like, Sazed is at absolute highs believing that he's going to show up, and Demue's almost completely fallen at the bottom here in a very different way. And just a quote before we kind of get to the end here, Demue says, "I felt like a man waiting his turn before the headsman ever since we spotted those Koloss. Maybe the survivor doesn't want us to succeed here. Sometimes people just have to die." And this seems to be very kind of counter to the survivorist faith, and like a loss of it here in the end. Like, I can't stand up to the reality of the circumstance. Obviously, there is something to the survivor faith that stretches to say, like, well, I deserve this, I guess, which is like the rationale. But what do you think?
I don't think he's of the mind that he deserves it anymore. He was earlier, and then
I think he is right there. That quote,
I think, is putting trust in the survivor despite it not meaning that he's going to thrive through it, and saying, like, this plan is bigger than us specifically.
Okay, so you're not suggesting that you don't think that they're on opposite sides of the spectrum. You're saying that they are kind of on the same coin. Like, they're both deeply in their faith, as opposed to Demue kind of being... I can see that. I don't know if I fully agree with it, but I can see it.
Yeah, sometimes people just have to die.
Mm-hmm.
That's not him falling out of faith. That's him saying, like, that Kelsier's plan for us, or the survivor's plan for us, is to perish here, but put up as big of a fight as possible. And hey, we're distracting this giant army. Maybe there's something else going on, because that army isn't wherever it could be otherwise. You know what I'm trying to say?
I do. I do get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it that way. I think that makes sense. It is less of a loss of faith and more of it. It just feels so loosey-goosey to me.
It does.
As far as, like, an interpretation is. You know what I mean? Like, it's... Yeah.
But he's not saying maybe the survivor isn't here. He's saying maybe the survivor doesn't want us to succeed, meaning that he still believes that this is the survivor's
plan. Yeah, will, right? Yeah. I think that is completely reasonable, and that I think it makes a lot of sense to have two faiths, especially with what Brandon's going here, to have two faiths come to similarly different conclusions on, you know, what the end of the world means to them and their religion. Like, that's an interesting presentation too, to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's still dire circumstances that are changing Demue's perspective. So either way, like that's valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. You've convinced me. I'm wrong with that assumption. Yeah. Cool. All right. After the seer reveal, we go back to Vin throwing herself against Ruin, trying to destroy this god and malevolent force that she's dehumanized by not calling him a he, but calling him a thing from here on out. That's fine. And again, she's terrified of feeling the deaths that are to come when she hears a voice. Her husband's voice, giving a terrific speech that reminds me so much of Bill Pullman's Independence Day speech when he's, this is our Independence Day. But it is a really lovely moment of chills when he says, in the end, they will kill us, but first they shall fear us. And that feels very similar to the aforementioned Bill Pullman line. And it feels like that Braveheart charge. Yeah, exactly. And he charges out into what is an absolutely magnificent scene of combat, which almost feels like cheating because it's so good. And I mean that in the context of, like, ATM makes it so good. So it kind of feels like cheating, but it's still so good. We also, we see how when they begin to get close to running out, they run back and get more from Sazed, who's helping feed them the beads to continue to fuel the conflict. I assume there are other terrorist men doing it too, but, yeah.
Yeah. I just want to know, converted to like Final Empire monetary value, how much fucking money was dropped on this war right here? Because I think Ellen says that his little handful that he starts off with was like more than his entire keep and his family's entire fortune throughout his entire life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an incomprehensible amount of money based on the economic, It would truly shatter the supply-demand curve.
Yeah. Yeah, it would.
If it were introduced into the ecosystem. Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Flood the market.
That would be very good to know.
Yeah, that charge and that speech, though, are just inspiring. I felt like I wanted to charge in.
Yeah. It does make you feel like it's like, oh, fuck yeah. Like total great chills moment. And then the combat itself is pretty excellently written. It does lack just a little bit of drama because ATM does that naturally. Like that's just the nature of ATM, is that it makes you so good that it's a non-contest.
Yeah.
Even against 300,000 Koloss, which is why I think he does a really good job of inserting stakes a little bit further down the road here. But at first it does have kind of that gleam of,
I think it could have been done in a way where you get these little glimpses of moves that had to be made in order to fight like 8 Koloss at once.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't get a ton of that.
Instead, we get almost like a 300-esque, slow-mo, dodge this, dodge that, get that one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quick. He's not burning pages here. He could have, but to maintain pace, I think, realistically, I think it is just the ATM that makes this feel different, but it's not a bad thing. Again, this is just a sort of a general thought, more or less, is it does feel a little bit less weighty in its own right, but the speech gives it a ton of heft regardless. So,
right.
Cutting back to our gods, we get Vin really pressing on kind of the emotions here. She says, "We create things to watch them grow, Ruin, to take pleasure in seeing that which we love become more than it was before. You said that you were invincible, that all things break apart. All things are ruined, but there are things that fight against you. And the ironic part is you can't even understand those things. Love, life, growth. The life of a person is more than the chaos of its passing. Emotion, Ruin. That is your defeat."
I see where she's going with this, but I do not truly buy this argument. And maybe that's just my fault. I don't know. But Ruin clearly has expressed emotions throughout this whole thing. Like, primarily rage and wanting. But there's still emotions, and he's still feeling them and expressing them. So it's logical to me to assume that he can understand those emotions of the people that he's interacting with. Maybe that's naive. Maybe that's just wrong. I don't know, but this feels like a weird, I need to force in love somehow as like an answer to defeat. I felt this way before when she mentioned it as well.
Fair enough. I guess thematically this does a good job. I think the line that stands out the most cleanly to me, right, is the life of a person is more than the chaos of its passing. I would have just ended it there. That is such a good summation of what he's actually going for here, that love, life, growth, whatever, it's a chuggy saying that you could throw up on a little sign and put on your mother's like dashboards or wherever, cabinets. Like it totally
put it in her
like,
car.
Yeah, put it in her car. Whatever. I don't give a shit. Love, life, growth, like I get it. It has this emotional weight to it, especially when read. I think it's delivered very well. But I do really think that my brain, my book, I would just end with the life of a person is more than the chaos of its passing, because that's what ruin is. Like ruin is degradation. Ruin is getting people to the point of decay. It is change. It's a lot of things. And I agree with you on the side of like emotion ruin. That is your defeat. That feels weird because ruin understands emotion. He is emotion in a lot of, like, he isn't actually emotion, but he's emotional in a lot of ways. It's not as though he lacks. He's not so like black and white evil so as to just be the embodiment of badness. He is much more nuanced than just a black void, which is kind of the way that like Vin paints him in an odd way that I don't agree with here. Yeah,
I agree.
It's very much the life of a person is more than just the chaos of its passing.
I love that.
Yeah, right. It's definitely one of the best lines in the book, realistically, because it is like this culmination. It's not about the end. It's about the culmination of everything that you were and could be. Sazed, we have a quick little intermission here. I think it's literally again like 2 paragraph. Sazed reiterates his faith, saying she will come. Of course, this is classic. It's nothing crazy. It's a quick cut. A lot of these are just quick cuts back and forth, even to the point of like literally blending together perspectives in different moments, which makes me go, are we in Vin's head when we're seeing, like, how are we viewing this? This is when the book gets just a little bit messy, but
yeah. Regardless, though, even though it's very short, it is good to see and experience Sazed post Sad Boy days. You know, it's nice to see him not wallow in his book catalog, Dead Religions.
Yeah. He's going to get there in a second. He's going to get back to all those dead religions. It's going to be so exciting. Elend has begun to run out of metals, though, in this moment, and we begin to see the soldiers fall to the Colossus as they run out of atium, and in addition to running out of atium, their own natural strength to just keep them going. Because unlike Elend, they all can't burn pewter like he is here. Beyond just their ability to see and predict the movements, they're running out of everything. And then Marsh shows up, our physical big bad in this story, just to challenge our boy Elend. Elend manages to wield a sword against him as Marsh pushes against it with allomancy, it is protected by something else. The power of Vin, of preservation, given to directly empower her love of her life, her husband, to guide him in this moment.
Yeah, much like preservation was able to funnel power into Vin through the mists. It's nice to see that come around. And now Elend is chosen by Vin. She was chosen by preservation.
It is that kind of great moment. And then our boy Elend burns atium with duralumin in a powerful burst, gaining knowledge, understanding, acceptance. It is so patently clear and unclear as to what is gained here. And I think that it's good. I don't have any complaints about it or anything like that. I just think that it is a lot, but it is enough for him to also feel acceptance because he has all of this in his head. And it's also full circle because the knowledge and understanding of as much as possible by doing this powerful burning push feels full circle for our scholar as well. So it's like, you know, it has implications there that I really like. I'll let you comment on that before I go into the rest.
No, I liked the description of the duralumin atium push. You're right. It's kind of ambiguous as to what's actually being gained here. I like to think that it just kind of pushes the scale a little bit. So it's not just balancing each other out, you know?
It's like comprehension. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think. Like full comprehension. I wonder if there's some future sight tucked in there in some way, shape, or form. Like some true future look in like distant futures or in comprehension of reality and knowledge and like the way that people will be so intelligent, you know, like I wonder how much or how deep he sees.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like a more clear explanation, but that can't really happen in this moment.
No.
So I like how it's described regardless.
Yeah. I do
passionately.
Right. Right. Well, it is a very passionate like description, and I think it's really well done, especially since it does end up becoming Elend's kind of final moments. Marsh comes at him and buries an obsidian axe in his chest, but with Vin behind him, as we said, even more of the power of allomancy flows through him, charging him, healing him to a certain degree, pushing him with pewter. But he's still wounded. Like he has this unbelievable manifestation of power pressed in him that allows for him to fight back a little bit, but he's down for sure. We move to human, and man, this was his part to play in the whole story. He charges down the tunnels, pushing people out of the way, and is the eyes of Ruin, or ears, and finds the pit empty with no A-team remaining. Elend burned the last of it in that final glorious push.
That's so good.
Yeah.
It just feels so good. Mm-hmm. And I can totally see this being a very dramatic scene in whatever sort of adaptation comes through of this mindless, semi-mindless, but controlled, lovable oaf of a 12-foot killing machine corpse.
Yeah.
Pulling off this seal and seeing an empty fucking vault. I really liked the imagery there.
Yeah, I loved it. I really enjoy it. I think it's a great shot. I think this entire chapter is so, I know I was just kind of ragging on it because it gets kind of blurry, but at the same time, from an adaptation perspective, this is so clear what he intended. This is so perfectly clear as he imagined jumping back and forth and it feels strong going into an adaptation, or to put it in your mind's camera. It feels good. It's not the cleanest prose handoffs at different moments, and that's a knock against it from a book perspective. But again, fuck it. Like this is a great. Mm-hmm. It's great. You can break rules as long as you do it well, and that's the rule. So Elend smiles in this moment, a victorious smile at the Inquisitor, and explains to some long-off god that his body and power are gone, talking to Ruin in the metaphorical distance. They'd taken it up and burned that power away, and Martian Ruin, in rage, cleaves Elend's head off.
I know I should be feeling sad in this moment, and I do, but more than that, I feel like this was a great representation, or the start of a great representation of the annihilation that occurs when these two powers collide between Elend and Marsh as this sort of stand-in for Vin and Ruin. I thought it was a beautiful end to Elend. Like he burned so brightly after being reborn as a Mistborn, and fought to the death in the most selfless and important way possible. So Marsh doesn't die at the same time, obviously, but I don't know. That's okay, I think. Doesn't have to happen instantaneously.
Well, right. I think that the idea that Rune's body is gone and that was the annihilation makes sense. Yeah. It was another trade. So it does feel like that push and pull. And I totally agree with you. I think in this moment, Vin also recognizes that she was lucky to have this extra time with Elend, and that this was not time that she was supposed to get with him. And so I think that there is that extra bit of kind of reflection from her perspective, because I think she also feels like she should feel sad, but doesn't in the same way. Mm-hmm. Again, I think she almost, not identically, but she has a similar state of feelings. And given she's also a god, so like how many feelings do you really have? Yeah. I agree with you. It was a very shocking moment to me the first time that I read it, because I did not anticipate Elend's death.
I didn't anticipate a beheading, but going into that fight, I kind of did. I would have felt, even despite...
I can't imagine it any other way, for the record. I just didn't anticipate it going in the first time.
Okay. That's fair.
Yeah, I think it does less of a service if Elend or Vin lives.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that. That speech, that final impassioned speech, just felt so final.
It does feel like his kind of last moment of, I get to triumphantly proclaim that I am this grandiose leader, and it is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, we're at the end of this chapter. We've got our final little bit here. Vin, with the power of preservation and almost everyone she knows and loves dead and gone, finds peace in this moment as opposed to sadness at the loss of all of these people over the course of time. She pressed onward, driving herself and the power into Ruin, exposing preservation and the plan he had held all along. That humanity, with the ability to ruin and preserve, was always meant to be Ruin's downfall. This potent combination forces his eventual end. She utters her final words before she obliterates the body inhabiting Ruin. You created the thing that can kill you, Ruin, and you just made one huge final mistake. You shouldn't have killed Elend. You see, he was the only reason I had left to live. And she obliterates the both of them, their minds puffing away like mist under a hot sun.
Yeah. So what does she do in this moment to actually like cause the obliteration?
So,
give him a hug?
I mean, so when she was running into the forest, she was feeling her like life force ebb away as she like if she pushed further, right? She was feeling. I think you did a good job of describing it as annihilation. Like she was feeling that annihilation on her presence whenever she tried to push directly against Ruin as opposed to what he was doing in the world. And so this is her just accepting annihilation as a trade.
Okay. I can get behind that. Regardless, for the rest of that, I think we talked a lot about that in the previous section. Like I feel like my feelings in the previous section very much mirror what Vin feels here. Just kind of at peace, despite being like there's sadness. Of course there's sadness and loss, but peace about it. And I think that's the healthy way to address this.
Mm-hmm. I really love this. I really love this ending. And I think that it makes the most sense for Vin. And I think we did reiterate kind of a lot of those similar feelings. I think that also, at the same time, I do have the smallest wish that trust would have tied in here to some degree. Like, her willingness to love and, like, accept people did, because in the end, when she was out of love, I guess she was just out. Is that supposed to be my takeaway here, Brandon? But, like...
And who's everyone that she loved? Like... It's
Stacy's
just
still alive. Breeze is still alive. Like there's
Ham's
some
still
holes.
alive.
Ham's still alive, but there are a lot of people dead, and I guess that's kind of her point. And I do think it's a little bit of an oversight to not point to Sazed. She does talk about the crew on the whole, but to like kind of skip over Sazed.
Yeah.
That said, if I think about it for just a second longer, I can also say maybe she knew what Sazed's job was about to be. Like she might have had enough of an inkling because of Preservation's plan and piecing it together that she knew that she couldn't, hold the power forever. So
that's fair. I could happily accept that as an explanation, but I still think it's a little bit too hyperbolic to say that almost all of the people that I love are dead, because we've interacted with so many people and a lot of them are still alive. Let's see. Trust. You mentioned trust and wondering why that doesn't play a bigger role here. I think we got the trust payoff when talking to Elend.
Yeah, earlier. We got the trust payoff earlier in the story. I get it. I just wish it would have tied in here a little bit. You're right. This is again where I go to a general thought that I've expressed a couple of times, where Elend and Vin don't change a whole lot over the course of the story. They aren't even really the main characters, despite getting enough character time to like basically that they should be. They don't really change that much, and we do get the wrap up there. I just wish it would have tied in here a little bit. And that's where I in my headcanon that I just recanted to you, I think that is the trust tie-in, is that she trusts Sazed to do the next step, to do the right thing. And so she chooses annihilation because she trusts Sazed to do the right thing. I would hope. That's my assumption.
I like that.
That's how I wrap the theme together in my own head. Definitely headcanon, but yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about...
Not right now. I think there will be more thoughts when we get to tie it all together in the wrap-up, though.
Okay. So, our final... Is there our final logbook? Second to last. It's not our final logbook. God damn it. We have one more. So, chapter 82, our last chapter. We have a logbook. Once Vin died, the end came quickly. We were not prepared for it, but even all of the Lord's rulers' planning could not have prepared us for this. How did one prepare for the end of the world itself?
Short and sweet. Fucking finally.
This is what all of the logbooks were before this book.
I know.
Like, they're all like a couple of sentences. How did I forget how horrifically long they get? Not horrifically, but to read out loud every episode, it takes up a good chunk of time. I've already talked about it.
How does one prepare for the end of the world? Like this, apparently.
I guess. Lord Ruler was kind of a prepper, right? He had like cans and food and water and shelters. Yep. He had an emergency shelter in the backyard.
Yeah.
I'm never going to not imagine the Lord Ruler as a prepper now. I can't believe I just came to that conclusion.
Oh, that'd be good.
Cool. We move to Sazed, of whom is shouting that the hero will come, and sees a pair of bodies fall down next to Ellen's corpse, of which he just saw. He scrambles out of the cavern, dodges Kolos, wearing all of the world's knowledge and history on his arms, ready to record whatever new was about to occur. He makes it to Vin's body, and she's dead, of course.
This is also where we see Ruin's body, right? But we don't get a very long description of it. It's just a short man with red hair. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume that makes sense to me, because Sazed would just probably assume it's another person that's been fighting, another soldier or something like that. And he's obviously too distracted with Vin at his feet to really notice. But he just easily dodges all these Kolos
because
that
he's got
feels
speed,
hand waved,
right?
Oh, he does have speed.
Yeah, he uses ferrochemy to get out there.
Yep, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, it is interesting because he taps a bit of steel to dodge. He moved quickly. You know, he's wearing his metal mites. It is it's just quick. It's so fast that it's like, you know, that's not the point of this. The point is that he scrambled to make it out there. It is the mechanic of how he did so. But
yeah,
but he's broken. He rejects the notion that this could be the end. And man, it's tough in the way that he's breaking down. And it almost seems like he's about to be buried in that old Sazed when he notices a power, stability, and he sees another one, a deep black smoke, and he sees this as the power of change, and he begins to piece it all together as he recants. The hero would be rejected of his people, yet he would save them. Not a warrior, though he would fight. Not born a king, but he would become one anyway. He takes the powers and slams them together, and he evaporates. And Sazed, the hero of ages, becomes a god.
So, was there a description of the manifestation of Preservation's power?
I would assume it was Misty.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, Mist.
He was burning so brightly on this newfound faith, but the recollection of this prophecy was so wonderful for me. What I did notice is the word he occurs several times, as does the word king. So, is this the true wording of the prophecy?
No, I think it's still the gender neutral pronouns, as was kind of discussed previously with the firsts, right? I think he's just recanting it as he remembers. I don't think it matters.
That's fair.
It's in a language that he
doesn't have.
Brandon Sanderson is not trying to be Tolkien and like write the language specifically out in front of us, you know,
right.
But he could.
He
and
does
I think
explain
that would be the presentation. Yeah.
He does explain that the conversion isn't truly 1-to-1 earlier on. But I am curious about the word king and if that is a 1-to-1.
So the term is even used before in the book as emperor. So it's clearly there's some conflicting notes there.
Okay. I'm trying to draw it back to
there's no gendering
said.
There's intentionally it's not meant to be a gendered solution.
Right. I want there to be more to what the first had said and a reason why it was assumed to be male as opposed to just sexism.
Yeah, I don't know. Can't speak to it.
Okay.
I assume it was just, well, there is the potential that, I don't know. I would have to do a little bit more reading. Well, here's what I'll do. I will pin that and we'll come back to it in our Hero of Ages episode.
All right. Deal.
Moving on from there. Did you have any other notes? Any other thoughts on like grabbing the power, evaporating?
No, it's just cool.
Yeah, fair. So our godly boy Sazed begins to take that knowledge of his keeper training and uses it and all of the faiths of the world to repair the planet, with their pieces of knowledge and distinct focuses, each lending something to its rebirth. The Bennett's charts restore the continents, the Nelizan and Trelegism to reposition the planet where it should have been, the Nelizan people, and Trelegism, the religion, to reposition the planets to where it should be. The Kanzai's knowledge of biology gives him the ability to repair mankind, to be able to ingest these plants again and no longer subsist in the Ashen environment, but instead live in another one. The Dadra's colors that he preached to clubs shortly before his death flow over the world as this artisan sort of reshapes it in this moment. And with that memory, I think firmly lodged is really cool. And the side of clubs as well as this character. I think that specific relation is really one of the deeper ones that I think gets skirted over, because the next one, the final one, is the Larsta, Mare's religion, and the beauty of the world that returns to it as such, and the flowers and all of the different things that created and caused inspiration. He is a very powerful reflection in this moment, as he says, the religions in my portfolio weren't useless after all. They weren't all true, but they all had truth.
I fucking loved the use of his copper mines, and how that all so cleanly tied together. It just fucking perfect. I really, really, really love that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think that it's great. I think it's such a beautiful way to end. You know, this book is the hero, and to repair the world that was breaking and falling apart. To say that was the end of the world, I think, is still accurate, because that world did end, and now we have a new world that Sazed really shapes.
So there is one thing in here that I'm curious about, and goes back to a question that we had last week, as well as something from way before, and that's Mare and Mare's religion. Had Sazed met Mare?
I don't know.
Because he talks about how the only religion that survived is the terrorist religion. And if she held that religion as it's described, that's not true. Unless this was something that he preached to her and she learned about through him.
So Sazed did know Mare. That's confirmed.
Okay.
There is an answer. Mare was a follower of the Larastra faith, converting to it after Sazed had preached it to her.
Okay, cool. That makes sense.
Yep.
I like that.
Yay. One would assume then that she maybe took those texts and maybe drew the flower herself based on the text.
That could be.
Which would also be pretty. Would make sense. And make it even more powerful. There's another note here that I find particularly powerful, that of the fact that Rashik and Vin had both only held small portions of the power. We know this because of the diminished nature in which Vin was able to wield preservation against ruin and explain some things about the nature of the power therein, and maybe her full ability to hold and maintain the power for an extended period of time. She's only here, this is a short period of time if we look at it from the planet and the battle and everything that's going on. But there's another note here that I really want to highlight. Ruin and preservation were dead, and their powers had been joined together. In fact, they belonged together. How had they been split? Someday, perhaps, he would discover the answer to that question.
I do now truly appreciate the Lord Ruler's title of the Sliver of Infinity in regards to that small bit of godhood that he had claimed. Really, what I'm getting out of this is I hope to continue to interact with our god boy Sazed in the next era of this world, assuming that if he's talking about how she only had a small portion of it, but he has the full thing, hypothetically, his would be more lingering.
His should be more lingering. He's got the full power, right? He's holding that power holistically.
Yeah.
Our chapter ends with Sazed acknowledging that he is the hero to span ages, that he is God.
God boy.
God boy.
God boy Sazed.
God boy. It's, Sazed's arc is fucking fantastic. It's tough to not say otherwise. This story, this book is so good in large part because of the way that Sazed really changes and really comes to the center as the intended main character, one of the intended main characters from the very beginning. He starts as a servant, and the servant to God pipeline is underrepresented in media. I really love the depiction throughout.
I agree.
And It's definitely something that I really appreciate, especially as thinking about the religions and as he thought about them over time in a reread. It was definitely one of my personal highlights. So, all right, we get to our final logbook here. Of course, it's a fucking long one. It's the longest one in the fucking book. It's the last one. Vin was special. Preservation chose her from a very young age, as I have mentioned. I believe that he was grooming her to take his power, yet the mind of Preservation was very weak at that point, reduced to only to the fragment that we knew as the Mist Spirit. What made him choose this girl? Was it because she was a Mistborn? Was it because she had snapped so early in life, coming to her powers even as she went through the pains of an unusually difficult labor her mother went through to bear her? Vin was unusually talented and strong with Allomancy, even from the beginning. I believe that she must have drawn some of the mist into her when she was a child, in those brief times when she wasn't wearing the earring. Preservation had mostly gotten her to stop wearing it by the time Kelsier had recruited her, though she put it back in for a moment before joining the crew. Then she left it there at his suggestion. Nobody else could draw upon the mists. I've determined to this. Why were they open to Vin and not others? I suspect that she couldn't have taken them all in until after she'd touched the power at the Well of Ascension. It was always meant, I believe, to be something of an attuning force, something that, once touched, would adjust a person's body to be able to accept the mists. Yet, she did make use of a small crumb of Preservation's power when she defeated the Lord Ruler, a year before she began hearing the thumping of the powers return to the well. There's much more to this mystery. Perhaps I will tease it out eventually as my mind grows more and more accustomed to its expanded nature. Perhaps I will determine why I was able to take the powers myself. For now, I only wish to make a simple acknowledgement of the woman who held the power just before me. Of all of us who touched it, I feel she was the most worthy.
So snapped at birth.
Mm-hmm.
During birth. That's a pretty cool explanation, I guess. Makes it less clear if, like, regarding hemalurgy and if that can affect people that have not been snapped yet. Do you think this is intended to say that she was supposed to be the hero of ages?
That is a great question that I don't necessarily think is intended to be answered. I think it says that she was groomed to pick up the power, but part of me leans into this idea that she was groomed to pick up the power so that she would eventually annihilate, like that was a part of the plan the whole time, and that to a large degree she wasn't intended to be the hero, but she was intended to be Preservation.
Okay.
If that makes sense. But the hero is the combination, right? The hero is both. So yeah. I think this foretells more that she was always intended to be the inheritor of Preservation. But in the end, the inheritor of Preservation had to do the worst and self-annihilate, basically.
Yeah.
To prevent the destruction of everything. So in a very different world, I believe that she was being raised to be the one, so to speak.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fucking
it's
earring,
great.
Though.
What's up? Fucking earring. Fucking earring, man. Crazy how important it is and how it's in every single fucking important scene and it's explicitly mentioned all the time. And man, does it not just feel like an absolute dedoy when you hit that moment and smack your forehead? Oh, man.
I mean, I feel like I picked up on it pretty early that it was something important.
But it being important doesn't mean that, like, you know why it's important.
I just assumed Feruchemy.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was all we were exposed to as far as magic systems go.
Right. Well, from a technical perspective, we had seen hemalurgy the whole time. But
yeah, fair.
Through the Inquisitors, but
that's true.
We didn't understand the implications. So
mm-hmm.
Our final section here is one of return, in classic kind of epilogue fashion. Spook returns to consciousness surrounded by his friends and a new world as all of the caverns have been pushed together. Ham with his children and wife, Demu returning and seeming to be in much better shape than he was previously without an arm and kind of in really rough shape. He walks out among a pattern and beautiful colorful somethings are littering the ground everywhere. Of course, we know these are flowers, but, Spook would only know them as colorful somethings. And Vin and Elend bodies holding hand at the center of this pattern. Vin in her mist cloak and Elend in his Imperial uniform. What an end for them.
What an ending. I loved it. I love this ending. I'm going to bring it back to stars here. Because in this, Spook says colorful somethings to describe flowers that we know them as flowers, but why would he know them as anything other than colorful somethings? Elend knows them as stars right off the bat.
Yeah.
That feels inconsistent.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what to say other than that. It just felt I'm hung up on the stars thing, man.
It's fair.
Mm-hmm. Are you reading something, or are you waiting for me to say more?
Nope, I'm reading.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna have to do some stricter, harder digging. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot on stars because there's planets. So there's a lot of different impressions of stars. That said, it's not often talked about because they weren't supposed to be visible. I mean, okay, the counter argument is aware of stars because of Sazed. The sun is technically a star. I don't know. I'm not in charge.
Okay.
But again, for next week, I will try to dig in and see if I can find something textual.
It truly isn't that important. And
yeah,
I'm just latching on for no real good reason.
Fuck you. Our final tidbit to talk about in Era 1 from a textual standpoint here.
Yeah, tidbit.
Tidbit. It's kind of a big tidbit. Spook finds something. It's the tidbit that I've been reading every single fucking week. It's a leather journal, our logbook that we've been reading from this whole time. In it, we find that Spook has been made a Mistborn and that this entire thing has been left intentionally for Spook. A big part of me here thinks that this is a wonderful parallel to the notes that Kelsier left in the end of the first book, of which Spook was excluded, and Spook here being handed a massive place and position in the new world as the holder of this information. It's a lot of faith that's kind of pressed on him. There's a lot in this short note that is intended only for Spook, but I wanted to throw it to you here at the end. What pieces of Sazed's final notes to Spook did you find the most interesting?
For me, the most interesting one is one that you kind of left out, and that's that the gift of Mistborn was given at Kelsier's request, apparently. And that makes for some really intriguing thoughts on who/what Kelsier is or was, and if this was an actual explicit request and conversation between Kelsier and Sazed in this moment, or if it was an assumed one based on what Sazed knew about Kel. I don't know what to make of it, because it's it's 3 words, and it's hard to go off of that. But yeah, that's the biggest thing that I was thinking about here. But absolutely, Spook is now made to be this very important character going forward in this world, despite us probably not experiencing that story. I don't know. I'm happy for him.
Yeah. Happy for them all, it's tough not to say everyone who survived, it's great to see him with his kids and his wife. That's awesome. Demu, being happy in the arms of a terrorist woman who was clearly helping him, and, Spook proving that he deserved to be a hero and then being turned into a hero.
Yeah.
That he idolized. So
he's not turned into a hero. He became a hero, and then he was rewarded with Mistborn.
Okay, yeah. Given, agreed. Just being a Mistborn doesn't make you a hero. We know that because there are plenty of Mistborn villains that are generally not good people. Yes, true. Yeah.
Oh, what an ending, though.
Supervillain. Yeah, it's great, man, and it puts, again, like every epilogue has, it kind of puts in the full context of the logbook that we've been reading and gives us that out. And that's it.
That's it. That's the series.
That's an era, man. Technically, you have the 11th Battle to read. It's a prequel, but it's a Kelsier prequel. But
should I read that before the wrap up?
You can read that one whenever you like. You cannot read Secret History, and you should not read Alamancer Jack.
Okay.
Until we start Era 1, and then I don't care.
Era 2.
So, yeah, I meant Era 2.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Cool. Well,
should we talk about what's coming up now?
That's it. Yeah. So we've got 2 episodes that are going to be coming out over the course of the next 2 weeks. So the first one that's up is going to be our own personal wrap-up, like we'd been talking about for the Hero of Ages, and likely some of our opinions about Era 1 on the whole. That's kind of the plan. And then we've got a couple of folks that are going to be coming up the week after that to wrap up Era 1 of Mistborn. A couple of folks from the Shardcast, specifically from Span Reads, which is the recent Mistborn reread podcast that they've been doing. Should be a lot of fun. Very excited.
Yeah. Excited to meet them.
Mm-hmm.
That'll be a fun time.
Very pumped. Yeah. That said, we've got a lot of fun stuff coming out over the next couple of months. We announced again that we're going to be going, obviously, into Era 2 here very soon, but then after that, going into the Greenbone Saga. So if you like to be ahead of us, it's a reasonable time to start reading that. We'll be starting that in January. So if you take your time and you want to know the whole thing and then experience a reread with us, do that. If you want to follow along, like we know many are, do it that way, whichever way you prefer. Mm-hmm. You've got time. So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, as always, Tim and Andrew. You guys are awesome. You keep our show going. Keep us alive, more or less. Check out the links to the show notes. You can find our schedule, our Patreon, our previous episodes, our websites, our social media accounts, all in one nice little convenient location.
You talked about job security earlier. You know who has job security? Tim and Andrew have job security. Yeah. In their role with us here. Like PJ had said, you can check us out. You can see all of those links inside of the show notes. It takes you basically to our website. Our website has everything. But if you do not click through, here are where you can find us. Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit, and Facebook. wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com, as well as patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey. We also have t-shirts on TeePublic. Like we said, follow the link. You can check it out. We also will be having our schedule posted for Mistborn Era 2. Unfortunately, we broke something in the website and didn't realize it, and it didn't get posted. I'll probably take a screenshot and share a rough one so you can have one, but I do have it. It's already done, fully planned out. I've already started my Alloy of Law notes, so I actually have a head start for once, and yeah, very excited.
Yeah. Me
to
too.
wrap this up over 2 episodes, and then to move on to our lovely Mistborn. With that,
it's a couple days from August, which means we're gonna have a little bit of a drunky episode where we resolve all my predictions.
There are a couple that I eat dirt on. I know that there are some because I already have them flagged from a previous episode in which we decided that we were going to hold them all until the end. But we also, I wanted to say that in September, I believe, September or October, we will also be doing Warbreaker as a short pour. So if you are looking for something to read over the next 2 months, do that. Sweet.
Great.
Cool.
Awesome.
We will see you next week.
See you soon.